I want you to get up now. I want all of you to get up out of your chairs. I want you to get up right now and go to the window. Open it and stick your head out and yell, "I'm as mad as hell and I'm not going to take this anymore."
This program consists chiefly of extracts from telerecordings of some past transmissions. The content is more limited than we would have liked, but we hope it will be adequate enough to give you some idea of our aims, our methods, and the standards we've reached.
It's clear that the whole Western civilization is at war with world terror.
Freedom is the right to tell people what they do not want to hear. We have now sunk to a depth at which the restatement of the obvious is the first duty of intelligent men. George Orwell.
The entire globe, even as it trembles in passion with the birth of new nations and shrinks in the hand of a dispassionate science, is today the site of a momentous conflict. As one of the adversaries in the conflict, we see a challenge as great as any in our historic past. A challenge not, we hope, to be met and joined in battle, but to be faced and fought in the hearts and hopes of men. It is the challenge of ideas.
I am Edward R. Murrow. For a little while, I would like to review with you the great conflict of our times, one which demands and must get the attention and the involvement of each one of us.
I see in the near future a crisis approaching that unnerves me and causes me to tremble for the safety of my country. Corporations have been enthroned, and an era of corruption in high places will follow. The money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. U.S. President Abraham Lincoln, November 21st, 1864.
America's leadership and prestige depend not merely upon our unmatched material progress, riches, and military strength, but on how we use our power in the interest of world peace and human betterment. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings. We decided long ago that the dangers of excessive and unwarranted concealment of pertinent facts far outweighed the dangers which are cited to justify it. There is little value in ensuring the survival of our nation if our traditions do not survive with it. And there is very grave danger that an announced need for increased security will be seized upon by those anxious to expand its meaning to the very limits of official censorship and concealment. No official of my administration, whether his rank is high or low, civilian or military, should interpret my words here tonight as an excuse to censor the news, to stifle dissent, to cover up our mistakes, or to withhold from the press and the public the facts they deserve to know. For we are opposed around the world by a monolithic and ruthless conspiracy that relies primarily on covert means for expanding its sphere of influence. It is a system which has conscripted vast human and material resources into the building of a tightly knit, highly efficient machine that combines military, diplomatic, intelligence, economic, scientific, and political operations. Its preparations are concealed, not published. Its mistakes are buried, not headlined. Its dissenters are silenced, not praised. No expenditure is questioned, no rumor is printed, no secret is revealed. No president should fear public scrutiny of his program, for from that scrutiny comes understanding, and from that understanding comes support or opposition, and both are necessary. But I am asking your help in the tremendous task of informing and alerting the American people. Without debate, without criticism, no administration and no country can succeed, and no republic can survive. That is why the Athenian lawmaker Solon decreed it a crime for any citizen to shrink from controversy.
Nonviolence leads to the highest ethics, which is the goal of all evolution. Until we stop harming all other living beings, we are still savages. Thomas Edison. Our government teaches the whole people by its example. If the government becomes the lawbreaker, it breeds contempt for law. It invites every man to become a law unto himself. It invites anarchy. Louis D. Brandeis.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
There's only one way to begin to deal with people like this, and that is you have to kill some of them, even if they are not immediately, directly involved in this.
A man without ethics is a wild beast loosed upon this world. Albert Camus.
It was 1945. The war was over. Slowly, painfully, life came back to the ruins of Europe. The war was over, but there was no peace. Despair crouched over the continent. Hopelessness circled Europe like a bird of prey. Why? What were the forces? What were the issues in a war that turned nations into rubble heaps and populations into beggars? The people wanted the answers. They wanted to know what happened and why. In the Palace of Justice in Nuremberg, the people of the world came together. For there sat the International Military Tribunal to judge the chief Nazi war criminals.
American Chief Prosecutor Robert Jackson opened proceedings.
Mr. President and members of the tribunal.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world
imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, because it cannot survive their being repeated. That four great nations, flushed with victory and stung with injury, stay the hand of vengeance and voluntarily submit their captive enemies to the judgment of the law is one of the most significant tributes that power has ever paid to reason.
Never before in legal history has an effort been made to bring within the scope of a single litigation the developments of a decade, covering a whole continent, involving a score of nations, countless individuals, and innumerable events. Despite the magnitude of the task, the world has demanded immediate action.
The main charge, which encompassed all the others, was conspiracy. That is to say, the premeditation of crimes and the concerted planning of their execution.
This inquest represents the practical effort of 4 of the most mighty of nations, with the support of 15 more, to utilize international law to meet the greatest menace of our times, aggressive war. The common sense of mankind demands that law shall not stop with the punishment of petty crimes by little people. It must also reach men who possess themselves of great power and who make deliberate and concerted use of it to set in motion evils which leave no home in the world untouched.
Under the doctrine of reprisal, as we understand it, any act which is claimed to be justified as a reprisal must be related to a specific and continuing violation of international law on the other side. That is, it is not every casual and incidental violation which justifies wholesale reprisal.
These prisoners represent sinister influences that will lurk in the world long after their bodies have returned to dust. They are living symbols of the arrogance and cruelty of power, of racial hatreds, of terrorism and violence. They are symbols of fierce nationalisms and of militarism, of intrigue and war-making, which have embroiled Europe generation after generation, crushing its manhood, destroying its homes, and impoverishing its life. They have so identified themselves with the philosophies they conceived and with the forces they directed that any tenderness to them is a victory and an encouragement to all the evils which are attached to their names.
The Nazi despotism, therefore, did not consist of these individual defendants alone. The primary vice of this web of organizations was that they were used to transfer the power of coercing men from the government and the law to the Nazi leaders. The Nazis, however, set up this private system of coercion outside of and immune from the law, with party-controlled concentration camps and firing squads to administer privately decreed sanctions. The two pillars on which the security of the regime rested were the armed forces, directed and controlled by the General Staff and the High Command, and the police forces, the Gestapo, the SA, the SD, and the SS. These organizations exemplify all of the evil forces of the Nazi regime. In administering preventive justice, with a view to forestalling repetition of these crimes against peace, crimes against humanity and war crimes,
it would be a greater catastrophe to acquit these organizations than it would be to acquit the entire 22 individual defendants in the box.
Nuremberg represents the first act of international penal justice that resulted in the recent creation of specialized courts and a permanent court. These courts cannot prevent the commission of crimes against humanity, but they can at least condemn them on the basis of an agreement between the world's great powers and deprive the statesman responsible of all immunity.
If certain acts and violations of treaties are crimes, they are crimes whether the United States does them or whether Germany does them. We are not prepared to lay down a rule of criminal conduct against others which we would not be willing to have invoked against us. Justice Robert H. Jackson.
I am convinced that we have an opportunity to bring to a just judgment those who have thought it safe to wage aggressive and ruthless war.
The time is 1949. The place, the Palace of Nations, Geneva, Switzerland. Here, 59 nations have met to create and set up an improved set of rules to provide a greater measure of protection for prisoners of war, wounded prisoners, non-combatant military personnel, and civilians not engaged in hostilities. Rules that have since been adopted by almost all nations of the world. It is only for the protection of prisoners, the sick and wounded, and the non-combatant civilians that Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions applies.
I believe that God wants me to be president. George W. Bush.
This debate is occurring because of the Supreme Court's ruling that said that we must conduct ourselves under the Common Article 3 of the Geneva Convention. And that Common Article 3 says that, there will be no outrages upon human dignity. It's very vague. What does that mean? Outrages upon human dignity. That's a statement that is wide open to interpretation.
International law prohibits the following: murder, torture, cruel treatment of prisoners, or taking hostages, humiliating or degrading treatment of prisoners, illegal sentencing and execution of prisoners without a fair trial by a regularly constituted court. By knowing and applying Article 3 of the Geneva Conventions, and whenever possible convincing others to do the same, you also further the objectives of the local government. You therefore will be accomplishing your mission and will bring credit to your profession as a soldier in the United States Army.
The court determined that a provision of the Geneva Conventions known as Common Article 3 applies to our war with Al-Qaeda. This article includes provisions that prohibit outrages upon personal dignity and humiliating and degrading treatment. And some believe our military and intelligence personnel involved in capturing and questioning terrorists could now be at risk of prosecution under the War Crimes Act, simply for doing their jobs in a thorough and professional way.
The day we see truth and do not speak is the day we begin to die. Martin Luther King. Each man must for himself alone decide what is right and what is wrong, which course is patriotic and which isn't. You cannot shirk this and be a man. To decide against your conviction is to be an unqualified and unexcusable traitor, both to yourself and to your country. Let men label you as they may. Mark Twain.
What happened in 9/11 is we didn't have a strategy, we didn't have bipartisan agreement, we didn't have American understanding of it, and we had instead a policy coup. Some hard-nosed people took over the direction of American policy, and they never bothered to inform the rest of us.
There are some neoconservatives who are so wrapped up in their philosophy that break an egg to make an omelet, or you, as one neoconservative put it to me, you need chaos, you need death, you need blood flowing in the streets to bring democracy.
Behind the ostensible government sits enthroned an invisible government, owing no allegiance and acknowledging no responsibility to the people. To destroy this invisible government, to befoul the unholy alliance between corrupt business and corrupt politics, is the first task of the statesman of the day. Theodore Roosevelt, April 19, 1906.
Now, when it came to motivation, it's probably a very sad commentary on where we are in the world today, that there are an awful lot of countries and groups out there in the world that have either real or contrived reasons to hate America. It wasn't that way when I was a young man, but then many things weren't the same way now as they were when I was a young man. But almost all of the groups and countries that might want to do this only had a negative reason for doing it. They wanted to hurt us. The Israelis had a positive reason, and it's one that a number of their supporters had talked about from the 1990s on up in what was called the Project for a New American Century.
A radical plan for American military domination first surfaced during the administration of George H.W. Bush. In 1992, Paul Wolfowitz, working in the Department of Defense, was asked to write the first draft of a new national security strategy, a document entitled the Defense Planning Guidance. The most controversial elements of what would later come to be known as the Wolfowitz Doctrine were that the United States should dramatically increase defense spending, that it should be willing to take preemptive military action, and that it should be willing to use military force unilaterally, with or without allies. This new reliance on military force was necessary, according to Wolfowitz, to prevent the emergence of any future potential rivals to American power and to secure access to vital resources, especially Persian Gulf oil. In 2000, they would craft yet another proposed national security strategy, this one published by a right-wing think tank calling itself the Project for the New American Century. At its core, the document revived the Wolfowitz Doctrine. It called on the United States to increase the military budget by up to $100 billion, to deny other nations the use of outer space, and to adopt a more aggressive unilateral foreign policy that would allow the United States to act offensively and preemptively in the world. The elimination of states like Iraq figured prominently in this grand vision. The document was effectively a charter of the Project for the New American Century, a neoconservative think tank in Washington. The founding members included Donald Rumsfeld, Dick Cheney, and Paul Wolfowitz of the Defense Department. 3 months before 9/11, PNAC founder and Zionist Paul Wolfowitz warns us to expect surprises in the future.
I will challenge you to think this morning about two words: surprise and courage. This year marks the 60th anniversary of a military disaster whose name has become synonymous with surprise, the attack on Pearl Harbor. Interestingly, that surprise attack was preceded by an astonishing number of unheeded warnings and missed signals. Yet military history is full of surprises, even if few are as dramatic or as memorable as Pearl Harbor. Surprise happens so often that it's surprising that we're still surprised by it. We live, once again, in a time of great hopes for world peace and prosperity. Our chances of realizing those hopes will be greater if we use the benefit of hindsight to replace a poverty of expectations with an anticipation of the unfamiliar and the unlikely. I am told that in your time here, you grew accustomed to looking beyond the next parapet. That kind of innovation and initiative are the keys to anticipating the unlikely and preparing for the unfamiliar, to being prepared to overcome the surprises that are almost inevitably going to come. Perhaps the simplest message about surprise is this one: surprise is good when the other guy can't deal with it.
Much of what these men wanted is coming true. They urged that the U.S. abandon the anti-ballistic missile treaty. It has. They wanted establishment of more permanent U.S. military bases abroad. That is happening in the Philippines and in Georgia and will likely happen in Iraq. They urged regime change as a goal of foreign wars, not just in Iraq. They wanted the U.S. as a global constabulary, their word, unburdened by the UN or world opinion, preventing any challenge to U.S. dominance. But, they wrote, a year before September 11th, such aspirations are unlikely to be realized without a catastrophic and catalyzing event, like a new Pearl Harbor.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
There's much more to this story than has come out so far. You will never in a million years convince me that those buildings, those towers, collapsed because those planes hit them. I'm confident that they were imploded.
The stories that were told about 9/11 were false. I mean, you take a look at the buildings falling down. They didn't fall down because airplanes hit them. They fell down because of explosives went off inside. Demolition. Look at Building 7, for God's sakes. It didn't fall down to its side. It didn't fall this direction or that direction.
When the first of the towers actually started falling down, I just said, this can't happen. It can't happen. And then the other tower came down, and I said, this violates the laws of physics. It can't happen. Those aircraft and those fires could not cause those buildings to come down in that way.
I think very important piece of information. The amount of energy required to melt the girders, the steel in the tower, cannot be gotten to a melt point with the fuel that was in the airplane. Not possible. So any melting did not occur as a result of the hit from the airplane. When you look at the tower coming down, what you see are at each floor successive puffs of smoke. Puff, 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 all the way down. What are the puffs of smoke coming from? Well, they claim they're from the collapsing floors. No. Those puffs of smoke are controlled demolitions. That's exactly what they are, because that's exactly how they work. And so the fact that the airplane hit, it did not cause that collapse of the building. The collapse of the building was caused by controlled demolition.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure.
Keep your eye on that building, it'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Move it back. All right, guys? Sorry.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
Is there any of the towers left at all?
What, the homes?
Yeah.
People have fallen down a long time.
But I mean, is there anything left? Is it just like totally gone?
It's a pile of rubble.
The buildings next door to falling too?
Yeah, the building across the street's gonna fall down now.
Wow. Wow.
It's not that big though, it's a smaller building.
I'm wondering, did you do any explosive residue testing on any item out of the building just to lay these ideas to rest?
Answer to that is no. We did not do it.
You mean you didn't look even after 118 firefighters reported explosions?
Answer to that is no. We did not do it.
You mean even after explosive residue was found in the dust?
Answer to that is no. We did not do it.
Is there any forensic study at all of the actual destruction of the World Trade Center towers?
Answer to that is no. We did not do it.
Jerusalem, cradle of faith to Muslim, Jew, and Christian alike. Jerusalem, the birthplace of modern terrorism.
After a bomb explosion caused by terrorists on the British headquarters at Jerusalem, one entire corner of the King David Hotel, a building of 7 stories, was razed to the ground. The stone floors were cut clean.
In scenes eerily reminiscent of New York 55 years later, the Jerusalem bomb was the beginning of terrorism as a media event, designed to capture the world's attention.
The latest casualty list included 65 killed, 47 injured.
The perpetrators, Zionist Jews, members of Menachem Begin's Irgun terrorist network. Begin, who would one day become Prime Minister of Israel, described this tactic as turning Palestine into a glass house, where the entire world was looking in.
I think it was one of these acts of violence that ahead of its time, I mean in an era before CNN, before instantaneous news, was choreographed precisely to attract international attention.
We were a minority, but we were a minority with a clear ideology that we must have a Jewish state to rebuild the state which was existing many, many hundreds of years ago.
Benjamin Netanyahu has publicly said the September 11th attacks have been good for Israel. Netanyahu said, quote, "We're benefiting from one thing, and that is the attack on the Twin Towers and Pentagon and the American struggle in Iraq." End quote. Netanyahu then reportedly said these events, quote, "swung American public opinion in our favor."
What would it have taken for a special operations group of any particular nationality to have done 9/11, either by having taken control of the operation we have been told about, of the 19 named Arabs on 4 planes, or having run a parallel operation where you have 4 planes being hijacked, but there is another operation being done with those in concert?
Officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and said, I want you to know, he said, "Sir, we're going to attack Iraq." And I said, "Why?" He said, "We don't know." He said, I said, "Well, did they tie Saddam to 9/11? He said, "No." He said, "But I guess they don't know what to do about terrorism, and so they think, but they can attack states, and they want to look strong, and so I guess they think if they take down a state, it will intimidate the terrorists." And, you know, it's like that old saying, he said, if the only tool you have is a hammer, then every problem has to be a nail.
You can't have a war on terrorism because it's not an actual enemy. It's an abstract. It's like having a war on dandruff. It's a slogan. It's a lie. It's advertising. That war will be eternal and pointless. It's idiotic.
And then I came back to the Pentagon about 6 weeks later. I saw the same officer. I said, why haven't we attacked Iraq? We still going to attack Iraq? He said, "Oh, sir," he says, "it's worse than that." He said, he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, "I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office. It says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq, and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran." I said 7 countries in 5 years. These people took control of the policy in the United States. And I realized then, it came back to me, a 1991 meeting I had with Paul Wolfowitz. So I called, and up there he was available. Scooter Libby came to the door. I met Scooter for the first time, and he brought me in, and I said to Paul, I said, and this is 1991, I said, "Mr. Secretary, you must be pretty happy with the performance of the troops in Desert Storm." And he said, "Well, yeah," he said, but not really." He said, "Because the truth is we should have gotten rid of Saddam Hussein, and we didn't." And he said, "But one thing we did learn," he said, "we learned that we can use our military in the region, in the Middle East, and the Soviets won't stop us." He said, and we've got about 5 or 10 years to clean up those old Soviet client regimes, Syria, Iran, Iraq, before the next great superpower comes on to challenge us. It was a pretty stunning thing. You mean the purpose of the military is to start wars and change governments? It's not to sort of deter conflict? We're going to invade countries? And you know, my mind was spinning. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld, and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down, make it under our control.
I want to be sure that this is emphasized, is that Jewish nationalism or Zionism is not Judaism. It has nothing to do with Judaism. Many of the Zionists are very secular Jews. They are not practicing Jews in a religious sense. Israel had a positive reason, and it was get the United States involved in a war in the Middle East with a powerful, enraged, anti-Islamic strain within the American public, that they needed a catalytic event to produce this. They even talked about it in terms of another Pearl Harbor is needed to bring the American people into this fight. And you look at the people riddling the American government, all of the Middle East people in State Defense and the National Security Council, Deputy Secretary of Defense Paul Wolfowitz, Undersecretary of Defense for Policy Douglas Feith, who used to be a friend of mine, by the way, from Philadelphia. These people were all part of the neoconservative movement. Many of these people are dual U.S.-Israeli nationals. All of their primary allegiance is to Israel. I'm an American. My loyalty is strictly to the United States. And I don't care what my ethnicity is or what my ancestry is. My allegiance is that. And my concern is only whether something helps or hurts the United States. And I think anyone who's a citizen of any country can very properly have similar feelings toward their country. What I'm concerned about is what is done to hurt America. And it is very clear that over a period of the last 40-odd years, that the penetration of the American political process, the effective subordination of the Congress in particular to Israel, when an Israeli prime minister can get 29 standing ovations from a Congress that can't give that much support to one of their own presidents, no matter how outlandish the statements, you have something as close to a puppet agency as you're going to find. Our policy in the Middle East has for decades been manipulated increasingly in terms of what benefits Israel and not what benefits the United States, even when that policy is articulated and supported by individuals who are sworn officials of the United States government. And to me, when a sworn official of the United States government, whether or not that person has dual Israeli citizenship, manipulates American policy, contrives crises and tragedies like 9/11, contrives wars like Afghanistan and Iraq, and now tries to get us into a war with Iran, all in the service of Israel, spending American lives in that process, they commit high treason, and they need to be treated in that manner.
There can be no liberty for a community which lacks the information to detect lies. Walter Lippmann, journalist and social philosopher, 1919. What follows is edited from the first 12 hours of television news broadcasts by BBC, CNN, and Fox on 9/11. Behold, the treasonous Zionist PR campaign to get the U.S. to commit war crimes begins.
The entire apparatus of the United States government, FBI, national security, CIA, the vice president, who you may remember was placed in charge of a domestic terrorism study group within the White House to monitor and develop plans to deal with a catastrophe of just this kind?
It's one of those targets that is at the very heart of how our system works. And if you can shut down the stock market in addition to creating a high loss of life, then you can bring extraordinary publicity to whatever your cause is. I don't think that this is the kind of terrorist attack that the United States will take quietly. I think it's basically amounts to a declaration of war, and I think it will be seen that way by the Bush administration.
War is a racket. A racket is best described, I believe, as something that is not what it seems to the majority of the people. Only a small inside group knows what it's about. It is conducted for the benefit of the very few at the expense of the very many. Out of war, a few people make huge fortunes. Major General Smedley Butler, 1881 to 1940.
And if we find the governments have harbored or supported the terrorists in any way, I think those governments become extremely vulnerable at that point.
Wouldn't it be likely that you could eliminate many of the smaller groups and concentrate? Could this be, in fact, the act of a government, an adversarial government, Iraq, Libya, some of the other countries that we have long suspected of supporting this type of terrorism, rather than the act of a cell, Hezbollah, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, that sort of thing?
Well, it is, of course, always possible. I don't think it is probable, because for a government to become involved in something of this size and symbolically so important that resonates throughout the world and definitely represents an attack against the U.S. would obviously mean putting itself into the category of rogue states against whom international sanctions can be mounted and life can become very difficult and unbearable. The support that the U.S. is giving to Israel, both politically and economically and militarily, is at the roots of most probably of what is happening here. The tendency obviously is to be vindictive, to take revenge, to become even harsher. There are already television talk shows saying that we have to give Israel the green light to go in the Palestinian territory and do whatever they want. I think that would be, of course, a serious mistake. I think that what we have to do is to work for an equitable solution that takes into account the interest of different parties here, and also maybe be more innovative in how we deal with these situations that are festering, that are difficult, that are complicated.
You were assessing intelligence, fearing something one day like this might happen. In your National Security Council, is this the doomsday scenario?
Nick, this is about as close to the doomsday scenario as could be contemplated.
19 people hitting 3 buildings and killing 3,000 people is horrifying enough, but it is not a doomsday scenario. In the Cold War, the U.S. had 8,500 nuclear weapons against Russia's 11,000 nuclear weapons. That was a doomsday scenario.
What we are seeing now is nothing less than the worst nightmare that one could imagine come to life, probably worse than anyone could have imagined. And I hate to say it this way, but this may be the day that America's luck ran out.
And to conduct a full-scale investigation, to hunt down and to find those folks who committed this act. Terrorism against our nation will not stand.
Political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder respectable, and to give an appearance of solidity to pure wind. George Orwell.
But I know this is a favorite national pastime of filling up time with conjecture, and there are people who have axes to grind and therefore want to point fingers. I remember the first time the World Trade Center was bombed, a so-called expert said it was the Serbs. And then when Oklahoma City happened, the same expert said it was Arabs, and was wrong both times.
To the American people for this terrible act. We are completely shocked, unbelievable.
Right, that's the view from the Palestinian side. Joining me now here in the BBC World studio is the former Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak, who's in London at the moment. Mr. Barak, welcome to BBC World.
The central message the Zionists needed to push was this is grounds for war and not an international crime to be handled by Interpol, FBI, etc. This, of course, would free up enormous amounts of money, create financial chaos, and shut down critical thinking. Ehud Barak is the most decorated soldier in the history of the Israeli Defense Forces. This Zionist kingpin has been called the architect of 9/11. He works relentlessly on the BBC, telling the USA what to do next.
First, your reaction, having heard what's happened. At least 4 planes have been hijacked, and there may be more.
The world will not be the same from today on. It's an attack against our whole civilization. I don't know who is responsible. I believe we will know in 12 hours. If it is a kind of bin Laden organization, and even if it's something else, I believe that this is the time to deploy a globally concerted effort led by the United States, the UK, Europe, and Russia against all sources of terror.
In your position as Prime Minister, Defense Minister, also formerly in the Army, were you ever aware of any incident planned like this?
I'm not sure, but this is not the case. It really happened in front of our eyes, and the question is what should be done in regard to it in order to avoid it in the future. It's going to be a tough struggle. There will be many tough and painful moments along the way.
What can be done? Because the great thing that is talked about by people like you, diplomats, politicians, world leaders, is preventing conflict before it happens. When you talk about a war, how do you take a war to 4 people?
I believe that the world intelligence community, in a concerted effort, can identify within few months the sources of this terror. They can identify the places where they are deployed on Earth. Every such a place is within certain country. The bin Laden sits in Afghanistan. There is a source of terror.
Who else do you identify, though? Because we're not saying he's responsible for this necessarily.
No, we don't say that he's necessarily responsible. We know where other terror thugs are living. We know that Ferganskaya Dolina in Central Asia is a major route for drugs, but at the same time major route for terror. And I know that President Putin is highly committed to the struggle against terror, and I feel that he should be part of this international effort. I believe that the MI6 is highly capable. You have proven it along decades. Your own skills in standing firm politically and acting pointedly, operationally against terror. And we should cooperate with
preemptively?
Both preemptive and by diplomatic means, namely rogue states. There are 5 of them: Iran, Iraq, Libya, North Korea. These kind of states should be treated as rogue states. And the same applies to even to leaders like Arafat. We've heard him just recently condemning this. I praise him for this condemnation, but he personally is responsible for many terror events that happened in the last few years. Same happened in some other capitals in the Middle East.
But Israeli sources are actually pointing the finger away from Palestinian militant groups and suggesting that they attach some importance to the possibility that the Saudi dissident Osama bin Laden was involved.
In a case like this, that's going to lean people towards talking about, Islamic fanatics. But we need to remember that, Islam is a religion, and it's a religion with beliefs and not terribly different from Judaism or Christianity. Or they believe in a God of love and justice the same as we do, and they're not all maniacs. And religious tolerance is one of the principles of our country. We need to hold on to that principle very tightly right now, because it's the principles you hold on to when things are tough that really count.
Fair point.
This was an act by a small number of madmen, and madmen don't characterize any part of humanity.
In the long term, what's terribly important is this is not a war won with bombs and with retaliation of Delta forces. It's a war for people's minds, and that is what is really crucial.
What does the word terrorist actually mean? Many terrorists would sooner describe themselves as freedom fighters. Could it be that the charge of terrorism could just as easily be made against Western corporations, speculators and policymakers?
When we talk about terrorism, it means what they do to us, not what we do to them.
The words terror and terrorism are being used to create incredible damage in the world. The definition of terror is the use of fear to intimidate people, especially for political reasons. If terrorism is political, then there are two sides to it. And if that is the case, then both sides could or would be seen as terrorists by each other. How can this word terrorism be in all government documents as policy? It is too ambiguous and leads to irrational, blind emotionalism. These are not good words or targets for government action on behalf of the people. It seems more like going to war with ghosts or sinners. An international police action would have been more effective and lawful than wholesale murdering everyone who stands up to or criticizes us.
Mullah Abdul Salam Zaif said in reaction to the news of these terror attacks in the United States, and I am quoting, "We want to tell the American children that Afghanistan feels your pain, and we hope that the courts find justice."
America is reaping what it sows in oppression and implanting vengeance in the hearts of those who have been wronged by the oppression and corruption. However, in principle, we do not support attacks against civilians or innocents.
This mass terrorism is the new evil in our world today. It is perpetrated by fanatics who are utterly indifferent to the sanctity of human life. And we, the democracies of this world, are going to have to come together to fight it together and eradicate this evil completely from our world.
Whoever carried this out isn't interested in making claims of responsibility. Presumably, if they did it for religious motives, well, God knows they've done it. So there's really nothing else to prove. The fact is that we knew then, and the new administration knows perfectly well, that there was this animus out there, this fury that had already generated very dangerous conspiracies against the United States. And there was an understanding, and there is now, or there was up until the minute before this attack took place, that this animus represented a huge threat. The question really was what you do to defend yourself.
Sitting in that seat about an hour and a half ago was Ehud Barak, the former Israeli Prime Minister, and he said to me he saw this as a war on civilization. And I challenged him on this. He said we must launch a war in return.
War, a massacre of people who don't know each other for the profit of people who do know each other but don't massacre each other. Paul Valéry, French poet and critic, 1871 to 1945.
There was an emergency press conference called by the Taliban ambassador in Pakistan. He wanted an urgent message to be delivered to the American people. He said that Afghanistan felt their pain and hoped the terrorists would be caught and brought to justice and to trial. Now, this is urgent because 3 years ago, America bombed targets in Afghanistan following the attacks on 2 of their embassies in Africa, and the Taliban clearly want to try and forestall any American wrath that might be directed towards them or directed towards Osama bin Laden.
Now, we are not apportioning blame in any way, and no one's claimed responsibility, no one's pointed a finger. But was any question asked about Osama bin Laden, who of course is on sovereign Afghan territory?
Yes, the ambassador said that Osama bin Laden could not have been responsible. You can see him speaking now. He was very clear about this. He repeated the Taliban line that he has no communication equipment with the outside world. Now, this is something that the Americans and others have questioned very seriously. The other thing that the Taliban ambassador said was that he hoped that America would launch a full investigation and reveal its evidence to the world before it made any move.
The Zionist criminal escalation to insanity continues on steroids.
So what I want to stress here is that any nation, and this goes for the Taliban and their henchmen in Afghanistan, any nation in the world that harbored anyone associated with this must be treated as though they were part of what is effectively an active war against the United States. And they cannot hide behind the traditional definitions of difficulty. And I think starting with Afghanistan, we're going to have to hold everyone accountable.
So we don't simply, in this conversation, we don't simply hold the group itself, whoever it is, the group itself accountable. We hold anyone accountable, any country, any government accountable if they did nothing to stop it.
And if the Taliban shelters Osama bin Laden, as they do, and if Osama bin Laden is responsible for this, as I think almost everyone is going to suspect, then the Taliban must be held equally responsible for what has happened today.
How does he know what everyone is going to suspect? The event just happened a few hours ago.
And Ambassador Holbrooke, I would like you to be specific. What does that mean? Are you talking about a retaliatory strike against Afghanistan?
Yeah, that's Jeff.
It's Jeff Greenfield. I'm sorry,
Hi, Jeff. No.
Is that what you mean? That if put the links together?
No, Jeff. Let me be very frank, and I don't want to lapse into bloody-minded verbal excesses at a moment of high emotion. But let's be very blunt about this. If a country or regime, the Taliban or some other regime to be determined by the intelligence community, has sheltered people who played a role in this, they cannot hide behind the attributes of they didn't know it, they had nothing to do with it. And if, in fact, these people are in some degree of collusion, I personally believe that the Taliban should be regarded as co-equally responsible for this, and therefore, if and when we consider military action, it is fully justified, and the Taliban should face the same consequences.
Well, let me just give you an update from the Middle East. The Israeli Air Force has been put on high alert following what has happened in New York City and Washington.
Then the next step will have to be a program to attempt to eradicate the source of this and to bring pressure and serious pressure on governments that harbor this kind of organization, and especially governments where we suspect that these organizations are located.
Sir, for a long time, there's been a kind of cat and mouse game, and I don't make light of this in any sense when I say game, between the governments that harbor terrorists and our government, other Western governments. It's all changed today, hasn't it? I mean, the stakes have changed enormously. The response likely will change enormously. It's all different, isn't it?
That's correct. When these terrorists dare to attack the territory of the United States, it then becomes a question of the functioning of our society. And we have to protect ourselves, and I'm sure we will. And it can't be dealt with one retaliatory blow.
It cannot be dealt with one retaliatory blow?
No. There has to be a systemic attack. I don't know what that means.
I understand.
And I'm not sitting here with a great plan. I'm saying this is what I would think our government will want to work towards. This is comparable to an attack on Pearl Harbor. And it must have the same response, and the people who did it must have the same end as the people who attacked Pearl Harbor. But it isn't just the people who did it, it's the people who make it possible.
These are the governments that harbor those who carry out these attacks.
That harbor or encourage them with their propaganda.
Henry Kissinger is the most effective Zionist propagandist in our country's history. The propagandist's purpose is to make one set of people forget that certain other sets of people are human. Aldous Huxley.
You seem to be suggesting that you have fears that America will respond in a very decisive way without necessarily the evidence to back up the reason for hitting the targets they're likely to hit.
I fear that could be the case. It's tended to be the case in the past.
given what happened in Oklahoma City with Timothy McVeigh, everyone immediately looked to the Middle East?
Yes, I do feel very uncomfortable. And I have to say that although there appear to be strong pressures indicating the Middle East, I still don't feel convinced. One of the reasons is that this attack originated on American territory. It required people to penetrate American security in a country that is acutely sensitive about the Middle East. And it required also enormous coordination. I find that really very difficult to understand.
Mullah Omar is the spiritual leader of the Taliban here, and he's recently issued a short statement. In that statement, he criticizes what he called an act of terrorism, and he was very explicit. He said that Osama bin Laden was not responsible for it, and he said that all he wanted for his country was peace, and peace for other countries in the world. And he went on to say that he believed Osama bin Laden could not have been responsible for such a complex act of terrorism. And he also said that if Afghanistan is a poor country, and therefore he believed there was no way that Afghanistan could be involved in such a complicated act of terrorism.
Our position is that if America has evidence and proof, they should produce it. We are ready for the trial of Osama bin Laden in the light of the evidence. Taliban statement.
And when I asked whether there were considerations being given to some sort of retaliation against targets in Afghanistan, one official said, "I wouldn't be planning your vacation there if I were you."
There are few words to describe the depth of this tragedy. It's an attack on the United States that we haven't seen really since Pearl Harbor.
And of course, if one doesn't act, there are always people in the wings, in the Republican Party, screaming for blood, applying the political pressure to any politician to carry out a reckless retaliation.
The most brilliant propagandist technique will yield no success unless one fundamental principle is borne in mind constantly. It must confine itself to a few points and repeat them over and over. Joseph Goebbels, Nazi propaganda minister.
The only one that can save humanity from this terrible danger is the United States of America. You know, only evil people can arrive to such a sophistication, and the measures must be radical as the evil itself. I think what should be done is to identify every country that hosts or supports terror and declare those countries as terrorist countries. I think there must be a call to all religious leaders, Christian, Muslim, Jewish, to condemn fully, without an excuse, all the suicidal bombers, suicidal person who in order to kill others they kill themselves. It's against the basis of our life, it's against the gospels of every believer. And then again we have to organize ourselves globally, because we are going over from a world of enemies where you have had armies to face them to a world of global dangers that we don't have yet neither a strategy nor an army to stop it. We have to get ourselves organized properly and fully and immediately. Permit me to say that today each of us feels American, like an American, with all the seriousness, all the pains, and all the determination.
And none of the respect for international law.
The whole of Congress has been evacuated. A number of senior congressional figures are calling this America's Pearl Harbor.
Ehud Barak is back for the fourth time on the Zionist-owned BBC. This sick Keller now has two helpers, but this time there is some solid moral opposition.
Mr. Barak, first of all, should we see this as an act designed to draw attention to what is happening in the Middle East, or should we see it as something quite separate from that?
It's clear that the whole Western civilization is at war with world terror. It might have some kind of indirect relationship to something that happened either in Afghanistan or somewhere else in the Middle East, but this is not the case. Once they are ready to hit the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, it means that we are basically at war. And I'm fully confident American people, which is a tough and courageous people, and have tough leadership at the helmet, they will know how to fight back. And I believe that leaders all around the world, here in the UK, in Europe, in Russia, the Russians will fully cooperate with this. Australia, New Zealand, Japan, Israel, of course, and others should join hands to defeat terror, period. We cannot afford this kind of threat to our whole way of life.
I'll come back to that point in a moment. I want to bring in Frank Gaffney, who's the director of the Center for Security Policy, who's in Washington. How do you think the United States will respond to this? And are you surprised, as an expert in security matters, that nobody had any inkling of what happened?
Well, to answer the second question first, I'm not frankly surprised, because this is precisely the way the cells that we're up against here, and perhaps their state sponsors, are organizing themselves and conducting their activities. It is purposely designed to keep the lowest possible profiles, avoid signatures, as they say in the intelligence business, and conduct their affairs in such a way that we won't know what's happened to us until it has happened. As to how the United States will respond, it remains to be seen, of course. My hope is that, as any number of people have said on this program and elsewhere here in Washington in recent hours, the United States is at war now. And I hope that the President will respond appropriately and accordingly. This is not a matter for business as usual, a judicial process, forensic investigations, and believe that we have been struck in a way that is probably going to be a precursor to even worse. And it is time for us to act as I think our friends in Israel have been doing for some time, quite correctly, which is to use such intelligence as we do have, to use such force as we have at our disposal to strike at and try to destroy these terrorists and their sponsors before they strike again.
But do you know who they are?
We probably won't know, if at all, for some time with precision who is responsible for this precise attack. Therefore, I would go after everyone who is engaged in terrorist acts against us, everyone who has made known their determination to do harm to the United States. I think we ought to use this as an opportunity, as has been pointed out by others, to put them on the run. Let them know that they've got no place to hide, and such places that they hide are going to be very difficult places from which to operate against us. I hope the scales are falling from our eyes as a people about our vulnerability in the largest sense. We are, in fact, a target for others' enmity, and they are using the means they have to, and they apparently are going to be a larger and larger set of means with ever more deadly possible effects, including, I have to tell you, missiles that are, I'm afraid, being acquired by some of the same states, some of the sponsors of terrorism, and perhaps even some of the organizations that we're worrying about today.
Agree with this?
Well, I think there's a concern here because we're building a case during the course of this program which leans heavily on the verdict that taking it out in retaliation on Osama bin Laden will be the appropriate way to respond. Now, I imagine that means a bombing raid on Afghanistan. What about all those poor Afghans who have nothing to do with Osama bin Laden and who would not be willing supporters of the Taliban government even in Afghanistan if they had any choice? This means, in the terminology of war, collateral damage. This in itself is not resolution of a problem, it's building more hatred and the perception that the United States wields power without compunction. That is something to be aware of.
Okay, Ehud Barak.
I don't think that the collateral damage is the real issue at stake now. Look at the collateral damage, so to speak, that had happened in the United States.
The term collateral damage originated as a euphemism during the Vietnam War. It refers to the killing of non-combatants and the destruction of their property.
We're dealing with a world effort, not necessarily Osama bin Laden himself. We all know the names of rogue states: Iraq, Iran, North Korea, Gaddafi to an extent, maybe one more. We all know the names of rogue leaders and the name of thugs of terror. And their names are known to the MI6, to the CIA, to the BND, the CM Bureau. And there is a need for joint effort, diplomatic, economic, intelligence-wise, and operation-wise, the same way that our ancestors fought against the piracy on the high seas. No airport and no port terrorists should be allowed to land, and whoever hosts them or directly or indirectly support them should be automatically isolated from the community and family of nations. This is the only way. Without this clarity of purpose, there will be no world order possible, period.
No world order possible, period? He just told us how far he will go to get his way.
Well, we're talking about declaring war, and you're talking about doing it in protection of democracy, and you're talking about sacrificing some of that democracy in the prosecution of that war.
Weapons these days are accurate enough. It's not a matter. I don't want to go into the operational details.
She's talking collateral damage. Example, innocent people dying. He calls this operational details.
Once there is a will, a clear will of world leadership to put an end to it, it will take a lot of painful moments, ups and downs, and even tough moments like this one, but we will prevail and democracies will overcome this phenomena of terror within 10 years.
The simple facts are that national leadership has to establish that terrorism is an illegal act of such magnitude now that it overwhelms the issues of social justice which cause us to quibble.
Any effort to slow down the military option is quibbling.
And restrain us at a time when a crime of this nature has been executed.
You're saying even over individual liberties in some instances?
Well, sometimes yes, and that's an unfortunate statement as an advocate of those very liberties.
So you have to be very careful not to jump to conclusions. And of course in the White House there will be enormous pressure to jump to conclusions and get anybody just to try to resolve the issue.
There can be no real war on terrorism because terrorism is not a strategy, it is a tactic. It is really a criminal activity.
In such moments, cool and reasoned judgment are more essential than ever.
Americans have long wanted to be liked by the rest of the world, and they're incredulous when people don't like them. Most Americans do not understand fundamentally in their hearts the motivation of a terrorist, whether he's from the Middle East or the Japanese Red Army, as somebody on the wires has speculated, to try to do harm to a country that they think wants only to do good in this world. So as a result, they cannot make a connection between America's policies in, for instance, the Middle East and terrorist acts on their own soil. One other generalization. Americans have a tendency to personalize foreign policy. Hence the rush to judgment that it was Osama bin Laden who was behind this. For all we know, this is true, but we don't have the evidence yet.
And remember Oklahoma City.
And remember Oklahoma City, which was initially blamed on Osama bin Laden and other suspects. So there's a tendency to view the world as individuals who are out to do us harm, not as movements, differing opinions, impersonal forces arrayed in opposition to what the United States stands for.
You know, it's like a Pearl Harbor, like a new form of a war, or like a terrible new arm, and we have to take it very seriously. Our hearts is clearly with the people of the United States, but this was not an attack just upon America. It was an attack upon civilization, upon humanity, an attempt to introduce the jungle as the rule of our time and our days. And I think we have to take it very seriously. We are going over from a world of enemies and armies to a world of dangers of a global nature without strategies and without organizations. We have to get ourselves organized. Now, as we feel so deeply with the United States, we know that the United States is determined and strong and will take again the lead to guarantee freedom, to enable people to fly safely, to walk in the streets unthreatened, and really to bring us back to normal life.
Now, as a country, Israel has often been on the receiving end of attacks, although nothing as spectacular as this. What sort of advice would you give to Washington?
To organize it globally in both directions, to identify every country that hosts or supports terror or terrorism, to stop it, otherwise they will be declared as a country of terror with all the consequences. Secondly, to call upon all leaders of religion and culture to stand up and declare themselves against this phenomena of suicidal terror, because it's becoming one of the greatest dangers of our time. It goes against the gospel, and the clergymen have to call each in his own religion to put an end to it.
One final question, Mr. Perez. Many people suspect a Middle East dimension to these attacks. Do you think there's a possibility that American public opinion might want to disengage from the Middle East because they see it as too risky now for America?
I don't think it has to do with the region. It has to do with the form of confrontation and war. There were acts of terror in the United States disconnected with the Middle East, and there are terror in many other places all over the world, including Turkey, including Algeria, including Pakistan. And we have to get ourselves organized not to let small mafias of killers, of cheaters, of liars to disturb life.
What I imagine will happen is if the Americans decide in their own minds that Osama bin Laden was indeed guilty, that they will attack Afghanistan very heavily with missiles, and that perhaps they might target in particular the Taliban government, because bin Laden himself is going to be, I would have thought, almost impossible to hit. He's probably far away in the mountains now. He's got his own communication system, which the Americans can't apparently chip into in any sense. And I think it'll be the hosts that suffer rather than the guest himself.
War against terror is an international war, a war of a coalition of the free world against all the terror groups and against whoever believes that can pose a threat to freedom. This is a war between the good and the bad, between humanity and those who are bloodthirsty. The criminal attack today on innocent civilians in the United States is a turning point in war against international terror. Even if the war against terror is long, and even if the terror will try to raise its head again, there won't be any room in the world in which terrorists, their assistants, and those who send them to be able to find a shelter or a refuge.
This really is a war with terrorism, and we need to be prepared to act as if we are at war, and that does not necessarily mean that you have to strike back only at those that you know were the perpetrators of this thing. And we know a lot of governments that have financed and supported terrorism, and you start with Osama bin Laden, I suppose, and you start with the Afghans.
Well,
but
what can you do, Mr. Secretary?
What you do, and this is what you do, is you strike at them militarily. I mean, I know this is going to sound awful, but my point is there's only one way to begin to deal with people like this, and that is you have to kill some of them, even if they are not immediately, directly involved in this thing.
He wants Americans to agree to bypass international law and kill people not accused of this crime at all.
We think the price is worth it.
So you're not talking about a long, drawn-out investigation as we had with Pan Am 103 over Lockerbie,
I hope not.
A long, drawn-out effort to extradite possible suspects.
I hope not. I hope not, because if that's the case, well, you saw what happened with Pan Am 103. I mean, by the time it was all done, first of all, many people had lost all interest in the subject.
This murderous thug just admitted 9/11 is first and foremost about public relations.
This is an act of war. When they compare this to Pearl Harbor, I don't think they're wrong in the sense that it's a surprise attack, and I suspect, if we are wise about this, Pearl Harbor brought the American people together and made us recognize we had something we had to deal with. Perhaps this will do the same thing for all of us.
He sets himself apart as an Israeli firster in his last statement.
Pearl Harbor brought the American people together and made us recognize we had something we had to deal with. perhaps this will do the same thing for all of us.
And this operation may have been sophisticated enough that people may now start to look hard at whether a government such as possibly Iraq, which is the one government that has praised this undertaking, may be involved. I think the Clinton administration did not look closely enough at that possibility, and hopefully the Bush administration now will. But we should at least take a look at whether there could have been Iraqi involvement in this as well. Well, one thing I hope they learned is that some guidelines that were adopted by the CIA, I hasten to say after I left, those guidelines make it difficult, not impossible, but more difficult than it should be, to recruit spies inside organizations if those individuals have some violence in their background. Well, that may be well and good if you're recruiting spies inside hostile governments. There are a lot of good people trapped inside bad governments, but inside terrorist organizations, the only people there are human rights violators. They're people who want to be terrorists. So if you only recruit nice people as spies, you're not going to learn a lot about what's going on inside terrorist organizations. I think some of those types of guidelines that the CIA operates under now will get a second look. I hope a tough second look.
Libyan leader Muammar Gaddafi has just called the incident horrifying, calling on Muslims to help. How do you interpret that statement?
Well, my guess is that there are an awful lot of people around the world that are pretty frightened right now about what the United States is going to do. As you said, this sense of horror is likely to turn to a sense of outrage, and I think the rest of the world, and particularly people that in the past have supported terrorists and given them a safe harbor, and helped them in some way, are probably quite worried at this point about what may be coming against them.
The relentless use of harbor and Pearl Harbor are right out of the Project for the New American Century playbook.
It's clear now, as it was on December 7th, 1941, the United States is at war. The question is with whom? In December of 41 we knew. Today we really don't.
Jim, what are they saying in Tehran about these devastating attacks on Washington and New York?
There's been some very strong condemnation here from President Khatami himself. He described it as a terrorist act which should be very strongly condemned. He expressed great regret and huge sympathy with the American people, especially those who'd been directly touched or bereaved by the tragedies. He went further than that. He said that terrorism should be rooted out by international society, and that Iran itself would spare no effort in that direction. So this is really quite strong words from the Iranian president. The Iranians essentially have taken the line for quite a long time now that all terrorism is to be condemned, and of course they actually berate the Western countries, for some of whom have given sanctuary to the People's Mujahideen, which is an Iranian opposition group based abroad and which has carried out some very devastating attacks in the past here in Iran itself, killing civilians and top leaders and so on.
I think we need to very carefully look at all of the history of these terrorist operations and every shred of evidence that we may have on this one, and see if there's any chance there was state involvement behind it, because indignation and action is not enough.
And remember that this country is a country of laws, and those who oppose us are only countries that do not believe in a system of laws and democracy and the individual freedom.
In the past, Osama bin Laden and other terrorists who do not represent national governments, a distinction which is critically important, but are sheltered in various countries in the world, including Afghanistan, sometimes North Korea, Iraq, Libya, have played this shell game about where the government that shelters them and protects them says, well, we don't know where they are. I heard the interview with Henry Kissinger, and he and I are in full agreement on this. Any government which shelters the people who did this has to be held equally responsible for it as an act of war. And we are going to have to mobilize an international coalition for that position as we prepare to take the necessary military responses. If some countries don't participate, let them understand that they're joining a coalition of terrorists who have declared war on the United States.
Senator Dodd earlier today compared this to the equivalent of the bombing of Pearl Harbor.
Right, and you know,
He said, I don't think that overstates it. We may find out it will understate it.
Is there some suspicion as well in the U.S. intelligence community that perhaps some government may also have been involved?
Again, it's premature to try to determine who did it and who their collaborators might have been.
So I'm hoping that this is the kind of dramatic, terrible catastrophe that unites the entire civilized world, so that it's not just an attack on the United States, it's an attack on everyone who cares about, freedom and dignity and justice and humanity.
But there basically are four groups that you can imagine having the capabilities of doing this. Bin Laden is certainly one. The others would be some of the more radical Palestinian groups, which might be able to do this. And then, of course, there are two states, Iraq and Iran. And I think that's the list of possible suspects for the moment. We've got some guidelines, some rules that were established in the CIA in the mid-90s that have the effect of deterring case agents from basically trying to engage terrorist spies. And I think this kind of attack shows again the importance of intelligence, the importance of taking a very aggressive look at human intelligence.
Well, explain to us why, theoretically, the CIA would put these kinds of rules in effect. Does it make any sense whatsoever not to try to penetrate these terrorist operations?
My own view is that these rules do not make any sense, that in fact if you're going to get good intelligence on terrorists, you're going to have to deal with some very unsavory people. The rules were put into effect because there were concerns at the agency at the time that it was associating the United States with people who might violate human rights or be criminals.
I take it what you're suggesting, the CIA doesn't want to be in the position of having to tell Congress that they're paying these unsavory terrorists?
Well, I think that's probably what led to these guidelines being imposed in 1995. I think that in the wake of this kind of an attack, we're going to have to take a close look at that, and my guess is that those guidelines will be changed. But what we have to do now is find out who did it, and then we have to prepare a retaliation that would, I hope, be the most vigorous military retaliation we can against the people who did it and any governments that were in any way contacted with this, including, if it's in Afghanistan, the Taliban. And I think that the day of sort of talking about terrorism is over now. We've seen the catastrophe that unfortunately many of us have been worried about. It's happened. Tens of thousands of people have been injured and maybe killed, and now's the time for real action. I think it will be interesting to see how many of our allies who are today giving statements of full support, how many of them are really going to be with us when the time comes for retaliation. Then's when we'll know who our real friends are.
America was targeted for attack because we're the brightest beacon for freedom and opportunity in the world, and no one will keep that light from shining. We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them.
Terrorists by killing them. And I'm saying to you that that policy of not doing that may have hampered us.
Of course it's hampered us. No, we've been hampered by a lot of new rules. For example, you can't even hire people who have a shady background.
What kind of man is Colonel David Hunt? I think we can talk to him when we line him up and kill him.
We've got to also take care of the country or countries that have supported it. And war has been declared.
Okay.
Now what do you want to do?
Well, as you pointed out, Osama bin Laden is wanted by the United States right now. Sure. He's wanted for the Cole bombing. He's wanted for the bombings in Africa. There's no reason on earth why we should not be stalking and hunting down this man right now, just for those things. And then if he's implicated in this, then we have him already.
We've been hunting him. We've been doing all the ball and chain around us. With the people, I know the guys that are doing it. I'm telling you that they have not been. You've already heard where the national intelligence community is prohibited from hiring people or dealing with people that have nasty backgrounds.
Right, that's what Mr. Dunnigan just said.
That kind of stuff has got to stop.
I think we got to let the chains fall down and let the
Bill, you got to unleash the dogs of war.
All right.
Of course, the Israelis, who never miss an opportunity for cover, act.
We've just been receiving reports that Israeli tanks have moved into the Palestinian-ruled town of Jenin, that's in the West Bank. The tanks had circled the town earlier on Tuesday and cut off all access roads to it. The Israelis were saying they wanted to prevent possible suicide bombers in the area from getting out and getting into Israel, but now the tanks have actually moved forward and entered the town. That follows, of course, Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's speech, his response to the terror attacks in the United States, which he called a turning point in the fight against terrorism, that there should be an international war against the forces of darkness, he called them, and Israeli officials have also been asking the United States or Washington to lead a fight against Islamic militant groups. Now, of course, there's been no claim of responsibility yet or blame assigned for the attack, but Israel would quite like to see its battle against Palestinian suicide bombers and Palestinian militants as part of an international war against terrorism. And if an Islamic militant group is blamed for the U.S. terror attacks, then that might be more likely. This would, of course, be a cause of concern for Palestinians, who would feel then that the Israelis might have a freer hand to use their superior military might against the Palestinians.
I want to underscore John King's point. Richard Holbrooke on our air said, if the Taliban in Afghanistan is shielding bin Laden and he is the one responsible, they must feel the full force of our response. When the President said we will make no distinction between the terrorists and those who harbor him, I think that's very much the point he was making.
In this sense, I do think it's like Pearl Harbor, because it's Pearl Harbor that led us all to come together to defend ourselves against the Japanese. I think this is Pearl Harbor in a sense in bringing us now to look at this terrorist issue as in fact we should look at it, which is if we don't deal with it now, it will be so much worse as the years go on.
But I don't think it's a policy failure. And if by that you mean that it's linked somehow to what may or may not be happening in the Middle East peace process, I would be very leery of making too direct a connection there.
We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them. That casts a fairly wide net of people who might be held responsible for this, indeed people and countries. I wonder if it was a surprise to you to hear the President say those words.
It was. I mean, we have struck at Osama bin Laden in Afghanistan, but have not struck at the government of Afghanistan. He seemed to be suggesting, if indeed this turns out to be Osama bin Laden, that he would also strike at the government of Afghanistan, at the Taliban, for harboring him. And that is a great deal more than just going after Osama bin Laden.
Other U.S. intelligence sources that I've talked to in recent years have said that they feel incredibly frustrated because they were following Osama bin Laden for many years. The NSA had tracked him in Afghanistan. They knew where he was at times, but they have their hands tied. They cannot carry out an assassination policy like we've seen here in Israel. At times, Israel does go in and assassinate those that they know are perpetrating attacks against the state of Israel.
Mr. Pearl, people have been talking about this today as an act of war. Is that how you see it?
Clearly, it's an act of war, both in terms of its magnitude and its purpose. Behind these acts of terror are the states that support terrorism, the states that provide the recruitment, the organization, the sanctuary, the planning, the training, the logistics, the money. This could not happen without state support and state sponsorship, and the United States must now do something it has been reluctant to do, and that is hold the states accountable that permit this kind of terrorism to take place.
It's a time for action, not for just interviews. We know the names of these rogue countries. We know the names of the organizations. The intelligence community know to tell us where they are deployed, and it is a time for action, even if it's going to be a very tough and painful and maybe a struggle that will stretch over a few years.
Reports, as I say, of some attacks, explosions in Kabul. You any knowledge of what that might be?
No, I have no knowledge of it, but if it is retaliation against Osama bin Laden, it's long overdue and should be just the beginning of retribution against the state sponsors of terrorism.
Because it's thought that Osama bin Laden, who's been linked to this all through the day, is somewhere in Afghanistan and shielded by the Taliban regime there.
Indeed he is, but he works with other governments as well. And until we come to grips with government support for terrorism, we will be vulnerable to attacks even on this scale. This could not be done without governments that assisted in training pilots, in moving people, in moving resources, and providing intelligence.
I think, as Richard Pearl said a short while ago, if, in fact, the United States is acting, it's a very welcome and long overdue step, quite apart from his culpability for this crime, or these crimes, I should say, this day of crimes. He is an enemy of this country. He has unleashed attacks against American citizens and property in the past, and there's no doubt, whether he did today's events or not, he would be up to it in the future, and he should be stopped. And those who are making common cause with him, who are sponsoring him, who are protecting him, who are permitting him to train in their countries, or otherwise making possible the kinds of sophisticated attacks he certainly has perpetrated in the past, should also be punished.
Richard Pearl, do you believe that there is a strong case for, if this is what it is, a missile attack on Afghanistan based on what's happened today?
Well, indeed. The fact is that bin Laden is permitted by the authorities in Afghanistan to operate from their territory. And I hope and believe that the United States will now adopt a policy of taking action in response to terrorist attacks against countries that facilitate and support terrorism, against countries like Iraq and Iran and Syria and Sudan and others, because until they pay a price for the support they give to terrorism, they will continue to enable acts of terror on this scale, and we must find a better way to cope with it than the policy of chasing down the individual terrorists.
Attacking everyone is not a better way.
Bin Laden, who is behind this very attack, when you and the whole world will realize the death toll that had been paid in this event, it will become beyond any doubt of anyone on earth in the free world that a concerted attack against her should be taken, whether it's bin Laden or not. Bin Laden had done enough to justify what he might suffer in the future, and the same applies to the Hezbollah, to the Islamic Jihad, to the Hamas, to the whoever is ready to host these kind of activities should be automatically isolated from the community of nations and be treated as a rogue state, and every group of terrorists headed by whoever is there should be dealt with.
It's because he's made the World Trade Center his target before. It's because he bombed the American embassy in Kenya, he bombed the American embassy in Tanzania, and he's made clear that he was responsible for the coal, probably. So he's made all these very targets his targets. And if today we find out that they've been attacked, I don't think it's highly speculative to focus our attention on Osama bin Laden.
But Richard Pearl, isn't a strike back at Afghanistan politically dangerous because you end up seeing pictures of civilians who've been killed and injured?
Well, we tend, when responding in this way, to be as precise as it is possible to be. It's worth drawing the contrast with the terrorist acts themselves, which were intended to destroy civilians and not the perpetrators of terrorism. But this mustn't be confined simply to targets in Afghanistan, because we know enough about the involvement of Iraq and other countries in the support of terrorism to know where we should strike back, and it is not just Afghanistan.
Well, I think there will be some hunkering down, frankly, because we will find ourselves obliged to make certain additional security precautions and certain additional infringements upon civil liberties and personal freedoms that I find very regrettable. But this is precisely, I think, what the terrorists are about. Changing America, not just frightening it, but changing it, defeating it.
Against rogue countries like Iraq and Iran.
It wouldn't have helped today.
It wouldn't have helped, but this event emphasized that there are certain countries in the world, North Korea, Iraq, Iran, maybe Gaddafi, maybe one or more else, that are ready to threat the world order by using whatever they have.
Up until now, the United States has often taken a quasi-legalistic approach to hunting down terrorists. You may remember after the attack on the US Navy ship off Yemen, they sent in the FBI agents, they look for evidence, they try and build up a case, bring them to trial. This is a very difficult approach when coming to deal with terrorists, because the terrorists do not leave a trail that is easily recognizable. So the United States has a second option. It can say, well, we identify various terrorist organizations in the Middle East and elsewhere who are responsible for these kind of acts. Osama bin Laden is one of those, and we will go after them whether or not we have direct evidence of that organization's link to this outrage or not. And then the United States will be faced with a decision: does it only go after Osama bin Laden, or does it widen this into a war against international terrorism, which would involve attacking more groups than Osama bin Laden? The third and final question that the Americans are going to ask themselves, and which Mr. Bush hinted at, is whether they are going to go after the states that support the terrorists, that provide them with the infrastructure and the base in which to act.
It certainly appeared he was widening the net there when he said no distinction would be made between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbored them. And as Tom Carver mentioned, that includes a whole range of countries.
That includes a whole range of countries, but within that range of countries, some are easier targets than others. You may recall that President Clinton launched various missile attacks at Afghanistan and Sudan following the terrorist attacks on the embassies in East Africa. And it's possible that they will do this again. But there are another range of countries which were mentioned by Mr. Pearl earlier in your broadcasts. He mentioned countries such as Iraq, Iran and Syria. Now, if the United States wishes to go after these countries, well, then we are looking at a different order of problem, because these countries can fight back, unlike Afghanistan and Sudan. The question becomes then is how far the United States is prepared to take that in order to eradicate international terrorism, if this is at all possible. A campaign of many years involving a whole range of operations will have to be undertaken.
What we've heard is that Israeli tanks have now entered Jenin. They are in the center of town. As you mentioned, there are heavy exchanges of gunfire. It's not clear how long they're going to stay or what they're going to do, but in the past they have destroyed buildings belonging to the Palestinian Authority infrastructure, in particular police stations and security offices.
Is this coincidental with what's been taking place in the United States, or is there a connection somehow?
There's not necessarily a connection. As you mentioned, the tanks have sealed off the town since about 24 hours, and the army said it was doing that in response to a suicide bombing in Israel. It says that in the Jenin area there are Islamic militant groups that are responsible for a number of suicide bombings in Israel, and they don't want to let any more bombers through. Also, the Israelis have, over the past 11 months of conflict, several times they have temporarily reoccupied Palestinian territory. The key thing is how long they stay. That usually is an indication of how serious the incursion is. However, we do have indications that the Israelis are ready to take tougher action against the Palestinians in the wake of the U.S. terror attacks. Government sources have said to us that Israeli officials sent strong messages to the Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat, telling him to put a categorical end to the violence, saying that the U.S. terror attacks showed that the violence could get out of hand. And I think this is an indication that the Israelis would like their conflict, their battle against the Palestinian militants, to be seen as part of an international fight against terrorism, not as part of an attempt to put down a revolt against occupation, which is what the Palestinians say. And if a Middle East group is implicated or blamed for the U.S. terror attacks, it's possible that the Israelis might get more sympathy for this view. This would, of course, be worrying to Palestinians, who would then fear that Israel might get an even freer hand to apply very harsh military and economic measures that are against not only the militants but also affect the population as well.
So in some sense, Barbara, there could be some kind of strategic advantage for Israel from this tragedy.
It's possible. I think it depends who's going to be blamed for the attack. If a Middle East group is blamed, therefore making the conflict in Israel connected to what happened in the United States, it's possible that Israel will get more sympathy for its fight against Palestinian militants, which will then be seen as part of a bigger picture. Even if a Middle East group isn't blamed, because these were suicide attacks in the United States, it's possible that Israel might get more sympathy for its battle against suicide bombers, and it's possible that the international community might take a harder line against Palestinian attacks, which might not be viewed, as the Palestinians say, as a fight against military occupation.
There's a lot of talk about these being kamikaze attacks, and hope that tomorrow the president is going to make a request to the Congress for an absolute declaration of war.
Yeah, but who would that be against?
Well, Osama bin Laden.
Declare war on somebody. You declare war on this one man?
Well, in fact, it's been done before. The third president of the United States, with the acquiescence of the Fifth Congress, declared war against the Barbary pirates, who were terrorists. And of course, what we have now is the 43rd president, the 107th Congress, and there's absolutely nothing in the Constitution that says you can't declare war against Osama bin Laden. Further to that, it is not only the Taliban who have provided refuge to him, but also, when one looks at it, in neighboring Turkmenistan, this man has been given at least acquiescence, if not refuge. And so I know that people are looking there as well as Afghanistan.
The second thing I want to underline is something you mentioned earlier in your program, namely that those responsible are the people who carried out the act, who helped plan it, who helped finance it, who provided a safe haven, a place where people could make their plans and so on. In other words, a country that allows people to make plans like this is to be held responsible. We need to preempt when we see something that's happening.
All of us have heard this term preventive war since the earliest days of Hitler. I don't believe there is such a thing, and frankly, I wouldn't even listen to anyone seriously that came in and talked about such a thing. General Dwight Eisenhower.
Mr. Secretary, if you're talking about eliminating the source of this, that would seem to suggest military action by the United States.
Absolutely.
Acts of war by us. A, do we need a declaration of war? And B, if we get one, and it is against Osama bin Laden and his collaborators of one kind or another, should military strikes be carried out against states, Afghanistan for one, others?
We need to put people on notice that if they harbor terrorists, they are going to get it from us. No place to hide.
And we have to make a statement that is so strong that any country that harbors, that trains, that gives money to, that supports, becomes an enemy of the civilized world. Because if this can happen here, it can happen in other places. Terrorism, as our report will say very shortly, isn't a crisis, it's an ongoing condition. And we've got to change the condition.
I mean, there's a great certainty among many people about where the fingers point. But ultimately, we don't want to be a terrorist ourselves.
The state that harbors them is as responsible as those who commit it. Therefore, are those civilians in peril?
Yes, they are. The powers that be in those nations have put them in peril. Saddam uses his civilians, as we know. There's no way around that, but we've got to face up to it. I agree with Diane that the greatest deterrent that we can have is the knowledge in the minds of potential terrorists around the world that there will be swift, accurate retribution. Unfortunately, there's just no way around that.
Sure there was. Treat this like a crime and use the police of the world to help us.
I mean, the number of threats coming in from Osama bin Laden, not just Osama bin Laden, but other organizations against the United States is a continuing flow of information. There probably has not been a day in the last 10 years when there were not terrorist threats made against the United States somewhere in the world.
It seems that the U.S. must be doing something wrong all over the world.
We can get an indication of the feeling of the Muslims worldwide by the fact that if you go to Baghdad or you go to Jerusalem today, you'll find that people are celebrating in the streets. That will indicate to you that there is a feeling of retribution or revenge against American atrocities being committed at the present time in the Middle East.
American atrocities?
American atrocities being committed. For example, their continued support of the tyrant state of Israel, the continuing bombing of Iraq, the unilateral bombing indeed a few years ago of Sudan and Afghanistan. We have a long list of atrocities which America have committed, which are enough for the Muslims and the Islamic movements worldwide to consider that they are in fact in a state of war with the American government.
Jonathan Clark in Washington, it seems this has come about because it's payback time for America's foreign policy.
Yes, that may be the case, but I think one of the things that does stand out today has been the number of messages flowing in from the Arab world, from all over the Arab world, and from Mr. Arafat himself, deploring this incident, condemning this as an outrage, and really dismissing any participation in this by the Palestinians. So I think that's an encouraging sign.
We have no word from the Israeli army about why they've decided to go into Jenin now, some 24 hours after they encircled the town, blocking all the roads in and out of it, saying that they wanted to prevent further suicide bombers coming out of Jenin after an Israeli Arab who was responsible for a suicide bombing attack in Israel on Sunday was accused by the Israelis of hiding in the town.
Has there been any word from the Israeli authorities as to who they think will have been responsible for the outrage in the United States?
No, there hasn't at the moment. What the Israelis are saying is that the attacks in the United States prove the need for an international war against terrorism, and they are prepared to help fight it. They say, we understand that the CIA has already contacted Israeli intelligence officials and are asking for their help in tracking down the perpetrators. But Israel is now on a high state of alert. We understand that land borders have been closed. The Israeli authorities have ordered that no foreign plane should fly in or out of the country, and the Red Cross also, the Israeli Red Cross is on, or it's actually the Red Star here is on a high state of alert.
The United States, to be fair, has criticized Israel for escalating the crisis in the Middle East by its responses to Palestinian terrorist attacks. But I think the United States will follow a different path. I think they will escalate. The United States has to respond. It has to show its domestic population that it will react. No population in a democracy can tolerate being attacked in this way, and the United States will respond. There are many countries in the Middle East and elsewhere, many organizations that are at this moment extremely fearful. The United States, I don't think, has decided on an option, but if we use the Pearl Harbor analogy, once the United States decides, it will act ruthlessly and effectively and will deal with this terrorist threat to the best of its capability.
I think it can go beyond harboring. The President said harbor, but I think those who finance them, those who train them, any of these countries, this is a new chapter tonight, and whatever may have been the policy in the past, the action today, I think, has changed that forever.
Colonel David, line them up and kill them, hunt again.
I don't think it's enough to take out an organization. You have to do the country and the people. There's no question, Saudi Arabia's involved, clearly Afghanistan's involved, but we've got state-sponsored terrorism. This was such a well-planned deal. I would find it difficult to believe that this was done by just a terrorist organization. This takes inside information. This takes a lot of planning and pinpoint execution.
Colonel David Hunt,
yeah.
let me ask you, if it is state-sponsored terrorism, I mean, not even sponsored, state-involved or state-countenanced or state-aware terrorism, is what you heard the President saying tonight, that we would make no distinction between those who carried out these deeds and those who harbored them, does that mean we rain bombs down on some countries?
I mean, are we mad enough now to do what we need to do and unleash the dogs of war?
I guess I wonder if we hit too hard, and especially hit the wrong people, if we're not creating a new generation of children and grandchildren of these new martyrs, and that's how they'll be portrayed, who will then come back and kill our grandchildren. In other words, when does the cycle of violence stop? When do we stop, keep hitting them, and they hit us? When do we finally say the insanity has to stop worldwide?
Well, yes, but the argument is we haven't hit. Well, I'll tell you what, Monsignor, hang with us just a second. We'll discuss this on the other side.
Their rise to power was based on fraud, deceit, intimidation, and coercion, culminating finally in terror and flame. Into that flame went the democratic constitution of the Weimar Republic and the freedom of the German people. For the fires set by the Nazis extended to the very Reichstag. Hans Gesavius, a witness who formerly held a high position in the Berlin police administration, tells of his investigation of the Reichstag fire.
Um es kurz zu sagen, zunächst den Tatbestand zu geben, haben wir festgestellt.
To speak briefly and to state the facts. First of all, we ascertained that quite generally, Hitler had stated the wish for a large-scale propaganda campaign. Goebbels took on the job of making the necessary proposals, and it was Goebbels who first thought of setting the Reichstag on fire. A group of 10 reliable SA men was made ready, and now Goering was informed about every detail of the plan. It was expected from Goering, and he gave his assurances that he would do so, that the police would be instructed, while still suffering from shock, to take up a false trail.
Using the Reichstag fire as a pretext for seizing power, the Nazi conspirators lost no time in tearing Germany away from a policy of peace.
What we saw on Tuesday completely transforms the problem. We've got to think anew about this. The policies of the last 20 years, whether you think they were carried out effectively or ineffectively, obviously don't work. This is not going to be a problem solved by locking somebody up and putting them in jail. It's not going to be solved by some limited military action. It's going to take, as the President has said and Secretary Rumsfeld has said, a broad and sustained campaign against the terrorist networks and the states that support those terrorist networks. The President is the one who's ultimately got to decide what are the military options that make sense. I can tell you that at the Defense Department, both his senior civilian advisors and his senior military advisors are really thinking, hate to use a Pentagon jargon, but thinking outside the box, recognizing that the assumptions that went into military plans on September 10th just don't apply anymore, and that one has to think about, if necessary, larger forces, one has to think about accepting casualties, one has to think about sustained campaigns, one has to think about broad possibilities, and we're trying to present that full range of possibilities to the President. He's the one, and I must say I've been very impressed in the discussions I've heard him in just in the last few days at his grasp of the breadth of the effort that's required.
We should have turned over the whole thing when we were attacked, if it was indeed Osama who did it. The whole thing, this is perfect for the UN. Kofi Annan is well trusted. And this is for CIA, FBI, this is for police work, not military work. And it's, again, that mixing up of the military with the other. I've got a wonderful quote from Time magazine. Now, this is a full-page think piece by Mr. Morrow. For once, let's have no fatuous rhetoric about healing. Healing is inappropriate now and dangerous. There will be time later for tears of sorrow. They always like to get the word time in anything in Time magazine. A day cannot live in infamy without the nourishment of rage. Let's have rage. What's needed is a unified, unifying Pearl Harbor sort of purple American fury. A ruthless indignation that doesn't leak away in a week or two. Let America explore the rich reciprocal possibilities of a fatwa. A policy of focused brutality does not come easily to a self-conscious, self-indulgent, contradictory, diverse, humane nation. America needs to relearn why human nature has equipped us all with a weapon called hatred.
That's extraordinary.
I mean, you know, Goebbels never pulled it off that well.
Dr. Kissinger, Congress convenes on Wednesday, and it is said that Congress will seek a declaration of war against terrorism. Do you believe Congress will do so, and do you think it's a good idea?
I think it's a good idea. I don't think it's essential one way or the other as long as we conduct a war against terrorism. And the Congress should make clear that it is fully behind us, which legal instrument they use.
Against whom will such a declaration be delivered?
The question of against whom to deliver it is secondary.
We just want the power.
We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will. We're going to spend time in the shadows and in the intelligence world. A lot of what needs to be done here will have to be done quietly, without any discussion, using sources and methods that are available to our intelligence agencies, if we're going to be successful. That's the world these folks operate in. And so it's going to be vital for us to use any means at our disposal, basically, to achieve our objective.
There have been restrictions placed on the United States intelligence gathering, reluctance to use unsavory characters, those who violated human rights, to assist in intelligence gathering. Will we lift some of those restrictions?
Well, I think so. I think one of the byproducts, if you will, of this tragic set of circumstances is that we'll see a very thorough sort of reassessment of how we operate and the kinds of people we deal with. If you're going to deal only with officially approved, certified good guys, you're not going to find out what the bad guys are doing. You need to be able to penetrate these organizations. You need to have on the payroll some very unsavory characters if, in fact, you're going to be able to learn all that needs to be learned in order to forestall these kinds of activities. It is a mean, nasty, dangerous, dirty business out there, and we have to operate in that arena. I'm convinced we can do it. We can do it successfully, but we need to make certain that we have not tied the hands, if you will, of our intelligence communities in terms of accomplishing their mission.
These terrorists play by a whole set of different rules. It's going to force us, in your words, to get mean, dirty, and nasty in order to take them on.
Right.
Our enemy is a radical network of terrorists and every government that supports them.
I think he comes at his view in his own way and through his own experience, but it happens to track very closely with the outlook of neoconservatives, especially since September 11.
U.S. troops began to round up suspected al-Qaeda supporters, the so-called evildoers. The first serious debate inside the Bush administration arose over what to do with these prisoners. Many in the Defense Department argued that the legal protection of the Geneva Convention should not apply to them.
The Geneva Conventions say the conventions apply to conflicts between high contracting parties to the conventions. And so al-Qaeda is not a party to the Geneva Convention.
Colin Powell and Richard Armitage at the State Department argued that the Geneva Convention should apply because it had protected U.S. soldiers for generations.
The matter was resolved at the president's weekly private lunch with the vice president. Bypassing the normal procedures for new laws, Cheney handed over a draft of a new presidential directive. It suspended the Geneva Convention protections for prisoners of war on terror. Bush signed the document. Most senior government officials heard about it only from news reports.
I was incredulous. I couldn't believe what I was reading. I'm a military man. I know what the corruption of that code will do to the fighting man. It was clear to me they had no idea what they were talking about with regard to the common soldier on the ground and what they were doing to him or her.
And it is amazing what it says. It basically says that the commander-in-chief can disregard any other law during time of war.
They're looking to expand executive power. 9/11 comes, and it is a state of emergency. And a state of emergency gives a host of people in the administration at the top a chance to try some things that they've been thinking about trying for a long time.
This resolution transfers the responsibility and the authority and the power of the Congress to the President so that he can declare war when, if he wants to. He has not even indicated that he wants to go to war or that he has to go to war, but he will make the full decision, not the Congress, not through the people through the Congress of this country in that manner. An important aspect of the philosophy and the policy that we're endorsing here is the preemption. this should not be passed off lightly. It has been done to some degrees in the past, but not so explicitly, not so much put into law that we will preemptively strike another nation that has not attacked us. No matter what the arguments may be, this policy is new, and it will have ramifications for our future, and it will have ramifications for the future of the world, because other countries will adopt this same philosophy.
Within hours after the attacks on 9/11, Defense Secretary Rumsfeld put Saddam Hussein on the hit list. An aide took notes.
I knew before 9/11 that many of the people who came into the administration were committed to toppling Saddam Hussein and doing it with military force if necessary.
Dan Rather is talking about prominent Washington figures in and outside of government known as neoconservatives. They had long wanted to transform the Middle East, beginning with the removal of Saddam Hussein. The terrorist attacks gave them the chance they wanted, and the media gave them a platform.
Richard Pearl? Next phase, Saddam Hussein?
Absolutely.
One person close to the debate said to me this week that it's no longer a question of if, it's a question of how we go after Saddam Hussein.
In the weeks after 9/11, they seemed to be on every channel, gunning for Hussein.
You're probably the hawkiest of the hawks on this. Why?
Well, I don't know that I'd accept that characterization, but it's probably not too far off. I think that the Baghdad regime is a serious danger to world peace.
Weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein, plus his known contact with terrorists, including al-Qaeda terrorists, is simply a threat too large to continue to tolerate.
Among their leading spokesmen were Richard Pearl and James Woolsey. Both sat on the Defense Policy Board advising Donald Rumsfeld, and they used their inside status to assure the press that overthrowing Hussein would be easy.
We would be seen as liberators in Iraq.
Major newspapers and magazines gave them prime space to make their case, including the possibility that 9/11 had been sponsored, supported, and perhaps even ordered by Saddam Hussein. The president, they said, should take preemptive action.
The biggest mistake we have made, it's our mistake, it's not the mistake of the Arabs, was not finishing off Saddam Hussein in 1991.
No one got more airtime from an armchair than Bill Kristol, editor of the Weekly Standard and a media-savvy Republican strategist. In the 1990s, Kristol had organized a campaign for increased military spending and a muscular foreign policy. In 1998, he and his allies wrote President Bill Clinton urging him to remove Saddam Hussein from power. And now, just days after 9/11, with many of their allies serving in the administration, they wrote an open letter to President Bush, calling for regime change in Baghdad. Over the coming months, Kristol's Weekly Standard kept up the drumbeat.
What are the consequences if the U.S. does not finish off this Saddam Hussein as the second step in the war on terrorism?
It would mean that the president, having declared a global war on terrorism, didn't follow through, didn't take out the most threatening terrorist state in the world.
The editorial page of the Wall Street Journal signed on. And so did high-profile pundits like the New York Times' William Safire.
Sapphire, will you wager, Ms. Wright, right now that Saddam will be out of power by the end of 2002?
Absolutely. I'll see you here a year from now.
If you go after Iraq, you're going to lose a lot of allies, but who cares? Remember.
Charles Krautheimer and other top columnists at the Washington Post also saw the hand of Saddam Hussein in the terrorist attacks. Jim Hoagland implicated Hussein within hours after the suicide bomber struck on 9/11. And the Post's George Will fired away on the talk shows.
The administration knows Hussein has vowed revenge. He has anthrax. He loves biological weapons. He has terrorist training camps, including the 707, to practice on.
It was proving difficult to distinguish the opinion of the pundits from the policies of the administration.
Iraq is in possession of weapons of mass destruction, contrary to their promises.
What the White House was now marketing as fact would go virtually unchallenged.
We know they have weapons of mass destruction. We know they have active programs.
As the Washington Post veteran reporter Walter Pincus would later report, the propaganda machine was run by the president's inner circle, officials who called themselves the White House Iraq Group, or WIG.
You wrote that WIG included Karl Rove,
the Chief of Staff Andrew Card, Mary Maitland, Condi Rice, Stephen Hadley, Louis Libby, and they were in charge of selling the war.
Selling the war, yeah.
Good evening. A long year has passed since enemies attacked our country.
Their chief salesman had the best props at his disposal.
And we will not allow any terrorist or tyrant to threaten civilization with weapons of mass murder.
They created that link.
The marketing group.
The marketing group. And the link was a twofold link. One, he had weapons of mass destruction. And two, he supported terrorists. And they repeated it every day. Anybody who watches television these days know you sell a product, not just by saying it once, by saying it over and over again with new spokesmen 2-3 times a day, and it sinks into the public.
Is there anything unusual about an administration marketing its policy?
I think each administration has learned from the other, and that this group is just the cleverest I've ever seen, and took it to new heights.
The TV, radio, print, other media outlets are as crucial to going to war as the bombs and the bullets and the planes. They're part of the arsenal, the propaganda weaponry, if you will. And that's totally understood across the board at the Pentagon, the White House, the State Department.
A proven menace like Saddam Hussein in possession of weapons of mass destruction.
The Iraqi regime possesses biological and chemical weapons.
We do have solid evidence of the presence in Iraq of al-Qaeda members.
The regime has long-standing and continuing ties to terrorist organizations.
Just repeat it and repeat it and repeat it. Repeat al-Qaeda Iraq, al-Qaeda Iraq, al-Qaeda Iraq. Just keep it going. Keep that drumbeat going. And it was effective because long after it was well established that there was no link between al-Qaeda and the government of Iraq and the Saddam regime, the polls showed that an overwhelming majority of Americans believed that al-Qaeda, that Iraq was responsible for September 11th.
Tubes, there's a story in the New York Times this morning. This is, and I want to attribute to the Times. I don't want to talk about, obviously, specific intelligence sources, but.
Now, ordinarily, information like the aluminum tubes wouldn't appear in it. It was top secret intelligence, and the vice president and the national security advisor would not be allowed to talk about this on the Sunday talk shows. But it appeared that morning in the New York Times, and therefore they were able to talk about it.
It's now public that, in fact, he has been seeking to acquire, and we have been able to intercept and prevent him from acquiring through this particular channel, the kinds of tubes that are necessary to build a centrifuge. And the centrifuge is required to take low-grade uranium and enhance it into highly enriched uranium, which is what you have to have in order to build a bomb.
Did you see that performance?
I did.
What did you think?
I thought it's remarkable.
Why?
Remarkable. You leak a story and then you quote the story? I mean, that's a remarkable thing to do.
And that's only part of it. Using the identical language of the anonymous sources quoted in the Times, top officials were now invoking the ultimate specter of nuclear war, the smoking gun, as mushroom cloud.
There will always be some uncertainty about how quickly he can acquire a nuclear weapon, but we don't want the smoking gun to be a mushroom cloud.
Simply stated, there is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us. And there is no doubt that his aggressive regional ambition...
Congress would soon have to vote on the war.
...that Saddam has resumed his efforts to acquire nuclear weapons.
But much of what they knew came from Cheney on television. There is no debate. There's no discussion. There's nothing. Nothing. The idea that the United States or any other nation can legitimately attack a nation that is not imminently threatening, but which may be threatening in the future. The idea that the United States may attack a sovereign government because of a dislike for a particular regime is a radical new twist on the traditional idea of self-defense. This administration has turned the patient art of diplomacy on its head, turned the patient art of diplomacy into threats, labeling and name-calling of the sort that reflects quite poorly on the intelligence and sensitivity of our leaders, and which will have consequences for years to come. Calling heads of states pygmies, labeling whole countries as evil, denigrating powerful European allies as irrelevant. In only the space of 2 short years, this reckless and arrogant administration has initiated policies which may reap disastrous consequences for years. Will we seize Iraq's oil fields? Becoming an occupying power which controls the price and supply of that nation's oil for the foreseeable future? There are some who think so. Frankly, many of the pronouncements made by this administration are outrageous. There's no other word. And yet this chamber is hauntingly silent. Silent.
The United States of America does not control its foreign policy with respect to the Middle East.
Now we're in a strange situation. There is nothing in our history to guide us. The world is running out of fossil fuel. We've got our eye on Iran. We have the fields in Iraq. We have our eye on the pipelines that run through Afghanistan. And we have a dictatorial system, as best personified by the USA Patriot Act, which just removes us of our Bill of Rights. We just go further and further along the road toward total war. We're sort of like somebody going along a minefield, dropping matches, waiting to hear the bang. Well, the bang might take us all out. I think everybody should take a sober look at the world about us. This is the most serious thing that has happened in the history of the United States.
I used to say early on when I was a kid, I'd say, when I was a young senator, I'd say, if I were a Jew, I'd be a Zionist. I am a Zionist. You don't have to be a Jew to be a Zionist.
When I traveled to Europe and England, I encouraged citizen investigations of 911. And I learned that to question 911 was to be labeled an anti-Semite. Even more bizarre, those who questioned the tragedy were equated with Holocaust deniers. And I wondered why. By demanding an independent investigation of what happened on September 11th, I became a political pariah. I was vilified in the press, and the noose tightened around my district. The pro-Israel lobby found someone to run against me, gave her over $1 million for her campaign, and then managed to make the election turn out the wrong way for me. Needless to say, I know now what a Zionist is.
The Israeli puppeteer travels to Washington. The Israeli puppeteer meets with the puppet in the White House and then moves down Pennsylvania Avenue and meets with the puppets in Congress and then takes back billions of taxpayer dollars.
The Jewish community, primarily AIPAC, musters whatever monies are needed to defeat anybody who doesn't toe the line or raises their head in opposition, or to turn around and support anybody who will unilaterally
support the interest of Israel over those of the United States of America. It's unpatriotic. I mean, our American interests should be first and foremost. That's not the case for the Middle East. It certainly is not the case for Israel. And that's shameful. That's a shameful chapter in American history.
America and Israel.
Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic. And the organization is strong and has a lot of money, and the ties between Israel and the American Jewish establishment are very strong, and they are strong in this country. As you know, they have power, which it's okay. They are talented people, and they have power, money, and media, and other things. And their attitude is Israel, my country, right or wrong, the identification. And they are not ready to hear criticism.
U.S. support for Israel is an enormous threat to world peace.
I think they're a disaster for this country. And many members of Congress believe that, but they don't dare say it. And they'll take on everyone. It's like a gang, you know, it's like mafia.
I mean, are you a mafia?
That is so absurd.
Mafia? Do you recognize any gang, mafia, you know? Yeah.
No, I usually have a response to statements like that, but I don't understand the statement, frankly. I don't know what power to intimidate where it's suggested that we have.
Media? Power on the media?
We say what we think.
We're the very opposite of the kind of clandestineness one associates with the mafia. I think what rubs people wrong about us is that we're so out front and audacious about saying things that go against the grain.
This psychological angst that Americans have in general about their failure to respond positively, if you will, in the 30s when Jews were being harassed by the looming Nazi regime, to the point that when we did finally get into finding out about what the Nazis were doing during the war itself, it was quite heinous. I mean, the concentration camps, the death of so many Jews and others. And there's some psychological guilt, I think, left over from that. And that guilt sort of excuses Israel when it does things that are not in its own interest, certainly not in the United States' interest, and are against our values and the professed values of Israel itself. We forgive those, almost blanket-wise.
And this issue of shared values, to have a state that's based on an ethnicity or a religion, it should not be considered a shared value with a modern democracy.
No, it shouldn't.
Yet there they are applauding.
It's another one of these things where we make these mental leaps that are tortured. We stand up against UN Security Council resolutions, for example, 184 to 2 or 184 to 3 or whatever, that we shouldn't be standing up against. We never reprimand Israel. And that's a recipe for Israel being the spoiled child that Israel has become under Netanyahu and Lieberman and others like them.
A new MSNBC documentary called Hubris reveals how members of the Bush administration, including Paul Wolfowitz, demanded there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein.
We all looked at each other like, what are they talking about? Who the hell, Saddam Hussein? Bin Laden hates him, thinks he's a heretic. There's no connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda.
Wolfowitz's so-called mistake has cost $3 trillion and 4,475 American lives.
Case closed. We've never been able to confirm any connection between Iraq and 9/11.
And the meeting with Ada did not occur.
We don't know. I mean, we've never been able to link it.
The Goldstone report unfairly singled out Israel for criticism. We challenged it. When Israel was isolated in the aftermath
of the flotilla incident, we supported them. When there are efforts to boycott or divest from Israel, we will stand against them. And whenever an effort is made to delegitimize the state of Israel, my administration has opposed them.
Helen, this is my inaugural moment here. I'm really excited.
Mr. President, do you know of any country in the Middle East that has nuclear weapons?
With respect to nuclear weapons, I don't want to speculate. What I know is this, that if we see a nuclear arms race in a region as volatile as the Middle East, everybody will be in danger. And one of my goals is to prevent nuclear proliferation generally. I think that it's important for the United States, in concert with Russia, to lead the way on this.
Well, Israel is one of the loudest voices calling for a tougher line on Iran's nuclear program, but Israel's own nuclear capability has never been put to inspection. Even so, this is what is known. Israel has 2 nuclear research centers at Dimona and Sarek. Latest estimates suggest Israel's produced at least 118 warheads with weapons-grade plutonium. The Jericho ballistic missiles are capable of carrying such weapons. A Jericho 3 is now being developed, able to travel around 5,000 kilometers, bringing all of Iran and Europe into its range.
There was an Israeli professor by the name of Martin van Creveld. He said that Israel's Air Force targets all of Europe's capitals. Well, wait a minute here. Now, I thought it was Iran that was the big threat. Is Iran targeting any European capitals? No, they don't even have any nuclear weapons as far as we know. And they certainly don't have any ICBMs that would be able to carry them. Israel does have these weapons. And this Israeli professor is admitting the fact that Israel is aiming them at Europe. I mean, if we're going to side between Israel and Iran, it would make more logical sense for us to target the country that's aiming nuclear weapons at us or our allies, I guess if you want to call Europe our allies. But instead, we're targeting this guy in Iran who, as far as we know right now, doesn't even have one nuclear weapon. I'm not saying that that guy in Iran is the nicest guy in the world. I don't know very much about him. But I know for a fact he's no more of a danger to us than Israel is, who is targeting all of Europe's capitals with nuclear weapons. Really, what's it going to make a difference if Iran isn't there? If Israel's still there, well, they're still going to be aiming nuclear weapons at Europe, so what difference does it make if Iran's gone? They don't have any. Israel's the one that has them.
An Israeli official quoted in Seymour Hersh's book as declaring, "We can still remember the smell of Auschwitz and Treblinka. Next time, we'll take all of you with us." General Moshe Dayan, a leading promoter of Israel's nuclear program, stated, "Israel must be like a mad dog, too dangerous to bother."
How, in your opinion, did the public go along with this? Do you think fear was the answer?
Well, fear is kind of the beginning of everything. Goering at Nuremberg gave an interview off the record, and somebody, a bright journalist, just said, "How on earth did you pull it off, you Nazis, to get the Germans, who were a civilized people for several hundred years, to turn into the bloody Huns and go to war, create concentration camps?" And Goering said, well, no sensible man is ever going to join your army and risk getting killed unless there's a strong reason. And that's fear. And we knew how to create it. The Bolsheviks are coming, or whichever enemy of the weak it was. The Poles are coming, the Czechs are killing the Sudeten Germans, and they'll try and kill you too.
Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I fear no evil, for you are with me.
The fear is constant, and it's just, for instance, every child of 9 outside the United States knows that Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with Al-Qaeda and nothing to do with Osama bin Laden. As a matter of fact, the two men despised each other. Every day for months, one day it would be the vice president, the next day it would be the president, saying how Saddam Hussein, we got to get him. We got to get him because of 9/11. We got to take care of evil all over the world. Bring him back dead or alive.
Now, if the people hear that from what they assume is their president, elected president, they're bound to believe it's bound to, there's some residue that stays in people's heads. They can't keep lying all that much. And so with terror, they have been able to come up with the USA Patriot Act, which shreds our civil liberties, and we're now at war with just about everybody. We're talking about possible strikes against Iran, North Korea, Syria. We have gone barbarous. We have gone back 2,000 to 3,000 years in human history, to almost pre-Roman times.
I frankly think that crisis initiation is really tough. And it's very hard for me to see how the United States president can get us to war with Iran. Which leads me to conclude that if, in fact, compromise is not coming, that the traditional way of America gets to war is what would be best for U.S. interests. So if, in fact, the Iranians aren't going to compromise, it would be best if somebody else started the war. One can combine other means of pressure with sanctions. I mentioned that explosion on August 17th. We could step up the pressure. I mean, look, people, Iranian submarines periodically go down. Someday one of them might not come up. Who would know why? We can do a variety of things if we wish to increase the pressure. I'm not advocating that. But I'm just suggesting that this is not a either-or proposition. Of, you know, it's just sanctions has to succeed or other things. We are in the game of using covert means against the Iranians. We could get nastier at that.
Here is Zionist warmonger and Pasha of the Republicans, billionaire Sheldon Adelson, explaining what kind of thuggish Zionist mindset he has.
So you would support negotiations with Iran currently so long as they first seized all enrichment of uranium? No.
What do you mean support negotiation? What are we going to negotiate about? What I would say is, listen, you see that desert out there? I want to show you something. You pick up your cell phone and you call somewhere in Nebraska and you say, okay, let it go. So there's an atomic weapon goes over ballistic missiles in the middle of the desert that doesn't hurt a soul. Maybe a couple of rattlesnakes and scorpions or whatever. And then you say, see, the next one is in the middle of Tehran. So we mean business. You want to be wiped out? Go ahead and take a tough position and continue with your nuclear development. You want to be peaceful? You want to be peaceful? Just reverse it all, and we will guarantee you that you can have a nuclear power plant for electricity purposes.
His arrogance is staggering.
Bin Laden is gone. Who is Washington's #1 enemy now?
Washington's enemy is an enemy that doesn't exist. We're fighting an Islamic enemy that Washington believes is out to kill us because we have elections, because we're free, because we have women in the workplace. It's an enemy that doesn't exist. It didn't exist when bin Laden was alive. It doesn't exist now. America is being attacked because of its foreign policy in the Muslim world, because of its support for Israel, because of its support for the Saudi police state, because of its presence on the Arab Peninsula. And until we accept that, until Americans can say to each other, whether you support aid to Israel or not, our relationship with Israel is causing this war, we are not going to be able to defeat this enemy. And Israel itself as a country is not the problem. The real problem is the leaders of the Jewish American community in the United States who influence and corrupt our Congress to support Israel when we have no interest there.
You imply that the Israeli lobby is dragging the United States into the wars, into
Absolutely.
the conflict.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my privilege to present to you one of the greatest leaders in the free world today, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu.
Thank you, Pastor Hagee, and thank you all for that warm introduction. There is indeed strong support in the United States for Israel. It cuts across the American people. It goes through changing administration. It goes through the different parties here and there. And if there's something that warms my heart and warms the hearts of all Israelis, it is this American support, this broad-based American support for Israel. So I want to say thank you, and I want to send all of you greetings from Jerusalem, the eternal and undivided capital of the state of Israel.
Back in Washington, CUFI delegates were briefed on what the organizers now consider the defining issue, the challenge of radical Islam.
At this very moment, there are evil men who worship death. It is a sick philosophy that goes by many names, but I haven't found a better name than Islamofascism because it summarizes what we are up against.
The Islamofascists have Israel in mind as an appetizer. We are the main course.
The difference, my friends, between Israel and the Arabic world is a difference between civilization and barbarism. It's a difference between goodness and evil. And this is what we're witnessing in the Arabic world. They have no soul. They are dead set on killing and destruction. Israel's enemies are our enemies.
What we are trying to say to them is that, A, we want you to continue your support for the state of Israel. Secondly, we want you to recognize that Iran is a clear and present danger to the United States of America and Israel. And it's time for our country to consider a military preemptive strike against Iran.
As we speak, Iran is...
For John Hagee, what happens in Iran is not just a matter of politics. It's also a matter of theology. His study of biblical prophecy has led him to believe that Iran will figure prominently in the end times, the apocalypse, and the return of Jesus.
Iran will use those weapons on Israel. Anyone who's smart enough to wave bye-bye knows that.
In his book, Jerusalem Countdown, he writes, Iran with nuclear weapons will transform the Bush administration's Roadmap for Peace program into a racetrack to Armageddon.
Playing up to...
From his reading of the Bible, he lays out a scenario predicting that if Israel and America attack Iran, Russia and its allies, including Iran, will attack Israel, triggering Ezekiel's war. God will crush the invading forces as, quote, he crushed Pharaoh, Haman, and Hitler, so that Israel and the world shall know that I am the Lord. Says John Hagee, the Battle of Armageddon will follow.
They intend to bring that bomb online. And if they use it, you think gas is high now. Life as we know it is going to change instantly and forever. And I'm telling you, you need to get your life ready to meet the Son of God in all of his glory. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. It's going to happen. There are going to be people in this tribulation period who do not take the seal.
There will be plenty of bloodshed.
They will have their heads cut off, and they will be
get ready, it's coming.
We are this close to the rapture of the church.
True believers like Hagee and his followers, it will be a day of deliverance. They will have been raptured, literally lifted into the air to join the Lord in the heavens.
The United Nations calls Zionism racism. They're wrong about that and generally everything else they discuss. Jerusalem in the Bible is the city of God. Jerusalem is the epicenter of the universe. Everything that's going to happen of significance between right now and the end of the age, today, tomorrow, and forever, is going to happen in the city of Jerusalem. After 31 years, our love for Israel and the Jewish people is rock solid. The fires of adversity have melted us together, and we are united. We are indivisible. We are today and tomorrow the voice of Israel in the United States of America without apology.
Hagee was asked by former Prime Minister Ehud Barak of Israel to resurrect this group, Christians United for Israel, in 2006.
January, I proposed to call 5 of the leading evangelical pastors in America. Was absolutely sure they would tell me no, and I could call the Prime Minister back and said I tried and it didn't work. Because I was going to form a national organization called Christians United for Israel, and that we would go to Washington once every year and stay for 3 days, and on the 3rd day we would see every member of Congress that would let us see it, and every member of the United States Senate, that we were going to go and in every state and in every city organize churches, and that we would go to Washington and speak about one thing: Israel, Israel, and Israel, none of our hot button situations. We are unified that Israel lives by divine covenant as long as the sun shines in the heaven and the moon reflects its glory at night. For that reason, we can say with absolute truth tonight that the Jewish people do not occupy the land of Israel. They own the land of Israel. God gets angry with any nation that tries to divide the land of Israel. The truth is, America should never pressure Israel to divide the city of Jerusalem to appease Washington, the United Nations, the Palestinians, the Quartet. No one, not ever. Israel is not a vassal state of the United States. Israel is a free and democratically elected government. They are appointed by the hand of God. Israel is the only nation ever created by a sovereign act of God. They are free to build. They are free to grow. They are free to invent. They're free to develop. They're free to become the greatest nation on the face of the earth by the sovereign will of God. We must unite and confront the enemies of Israel boldly and without apology. If we have courage, victory will come. And when the last battle has been fought and the last bullet has been fired, the enemies of Israel will be buried in the boneyard of human history. The flag of Israel will be flying over the walls of the ancient city. Israel will prevail.
Christian Zionism, by definition, consists of Christians, normally Protestant evangelicals, who believe that the book of Revelations predicts that certain steps must be taken to bring about the second coming of Jesus Christ, at which point the believers themselves will be raptured up to heaven. Many Christian Zionists believe that the second coming will happen soon, and because the return of the Jews to the Holy Land is a precondition of that, they support the government and people of Israel completely and unconditionally in all that they do, to include the expansion by force into historic Judea, which would include what remains of the Palestinian West Bank. Another aspect of Christian Zionism is the belief that the end time, as they refer to it, will be preceded by an enormous battle pitting the forces of good against the forces of evil, in which all the evildoers will be destroyed and the righteous will be triumphant. The battle is supposed to take place at Armageddon, an undisclosed location in the Middle East that some believe is derived from the name of the ancient Hittite capital Megiddo. That Christian Zionists believe the return of Christ is imminent and that there will be a major war in the Middle East preceding it would appear to be irrelevant to most of us. But it has in this case, real-world consequences because of the involvement of Christian Zionists in American domestic politics and their influence over some aspects of U.S. foreign policy. Evangelical Christians began to mobilize and became a potent political force in the 1980s. Many of the issues they supported were social, such as being anti-abortion and hostile to homosexual rights, but there was also from the start an identification with Israel and a sense that Israel had to be protected above and beyond the normal American foreign policy interests in the Middle East region. Through the creation of organizations like 2 million strong Christians United for Israel, or CUFI, headed by Pastor John Hagee, this focus on Israel obtained a mechanism for uniting evangelicals and providing them with a means and direction to lobby Congress to continue high levels of aid for Israel and also to resist any attempts to diminish support for Israeli policies. The Israeli government has presented both Robertson and Hagee with Gulf Star executive jets to make their evangelizing more comfortable. So the bottom line for me is that the Christian Zionist involvement in American politics on behalf of the U.S. relationship with Israel does not serve any conceivable national interests unless one assumes that Israel and the United States are essentially the same, which is unsustainable. On the contrary, the Christian Zionist politicizing has been a major element in supporting the generally obtuse U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East region and elsewhere in the Muslim world. It serves a particularly narrowly construed parochial interest that, ironically, is intended to bring about the end of the world, possibly a victory for gentlemen like Pastor John Hagee if his interpretation of the Bible is correct, but quite likely a disaster for the rest of us. Thank you very much.
One of the saddest lessons of history is this: if we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It is simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been so credulous. Carl Sagan. The real truth of the matter is, as you and I know, that a financial element in the large centers has owned the government of the United States since the days of Andrew Jackson. Franklin D. Roosevelt. The individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists. J. Edgar Hoover, FBI Director, 1924 to 1972. David Icke, the most controversial speaker in the world, thinks he knows what is behind this 9/11 rogue agenda.
Most people, the overwhelming majority of people in what we call conspiracy research, won't touch this subject, right? Well, I'm going to bloody touch it because I'm sick of it. And I'm sick of people being frightened and intimidated into not touching it. Thank you. Right. First of all, we as a human race have got to get our fricking heads around what this is, because it ain't what we're told it is. It's not about what's right and beneficial for Jewish people. Jewish people are its victims, not its beneficiaries. That's why I call this Rothschild Zionism. It was created by them, it is controlled by them to this minute, and it was created as a secret society within the web to massively contribute to the manipulation and control of our global society and individual countries, etc., etc. It's Rothschild Zionism. Because of the propaganda, we equate Zionism with Jewish people. It's not how it is. Zionism is state-organized terror. How many times do we see this in the newspapers? Never. End of Zionism equals peace. Israel, stop killing Palestinians. I am Jewish and I want that. Why don't we hear about this? We condemn any Zionist aggression against Iran. I thought every Jewish person in the world wanted to bomb Iran. That's what the media seem to give us an indication about. Another Jew against Zionism. Over and over. Zionist spokesmen do not represent world Jewry. Rothschild dynasty created Israel. It paid for the first people out of Europe to go and people Israel after the war. It paid for the building of the Knesset. It paid for the building of the Supreme Court building with all its Illuminati symbols all over it. And some of the people who've broken out of the family, I quote one of them in my book, have actually said, and as I've been saying for years, because it's bloody obvious, that Israel is not the homeland of Jewish people, it is the fiefdom of the Rothschild dynasty. And no matter what is said about Israel, this is Israel's response. Why? Because Israel is the fiefdom of the Rothschild dynasty, which also controls the American administration, the British administration, and so Rothschild's one arm is not going to criticize Rothschild's other arm. And it's not about, oh, these Jewish people here and these Jewish people there. It's Rothschild Zionists who are there, and they answer to the Rothschild dynasty. Therefore, they play out the agenda of the web in a coordinated way. Obama's immediate handler is a guy called Rahm Emanuel. He has served in the Israeli army. He's the White House Chief of Staff. He does whatever he says. His father, Emanuel's father, was a terrorist in the Irgun terrorist group that bombed Israel into existence in 1948. This guy is the second handler in the White House. His name's David Axelrod, Rothschild Zionist, and he was the man who orchestrated the entire election campaigns of Obama against Hillary Clinton and then against John McCain. Henry Kissinger, massive Rothschild Zionist, has served that dynasty's agenda for 40 years, if not 50 years. And he's now an advisor to Obama, even though he's officially a Republican. The American economy, the American economic team, is led by Timothy Geithner, Treasury Secretary, Rothschild Zionist, and Larry Summers, Rothschild Zionist. The entire Obama budget is run by the budget director, Peter Orszag, Rothschild Zionist, and this man's company was also advising the Icelandic Central Bank in the run-up to the Icelandic crash. The Federal Reserve in America, which controls the American economy in so many ways, it's a privately owned, not government-owned central bank, and it's privately owned by the Rothschilds, and the affiliates of the Rothschilds is Bernard Bernanke, Rothschild Zionist. He replaced Alan Greenspan, Rothschild Zionist, who was head of the Federal Reserve from Reagan Bush right up into the Boy Bush administration, and he systematically took away the checks and balances which allowed the mayhem of 2008 to unfold. We keep hearing about Goldman Sachs and all the mayhem that it's created, both in the crash of 2008 and the crash of the economy in Greece, fundamentally involved Goldman Sachs. Goldman Sachs is a fiefdom of the Rothschilds, headed by Lord Blankfein, Rothschild Zionist. The World Bank, headed by a Rothschild Zionist. The IMF, International Monetary Fund, headed by a Rothschild Zionist. European Central Bank, headed by a Rothschild Zionist. A stream of so-called czars, as they call them in America, controlling different policies and areas, policy areas of the Obama administration, Rothschild Zionists, including Cass Sunstein, who has actually written a paper saying people who have conspiracy theories should either be banned from expressing them or taxed for expressing them. Taxed! Climate change policy in the Obama administration is controlled by Carol Browner, Rothschild Zionist, and Todd Steen, Rothschild Zionist. Major area of policy. The American administration is utterly awash with Rothschild Zionists, and that is not by accident. It's because they're agents of the dynasty or agents of the control system. It's not about race. Mossad is not the intelligence agency of Israel. It's the intelligence agency of the Rothschilds, and that's why it turns up all over the world in false flag set up terrorist events and assassinations and all that stuff, because it's not carrying out the policy of Israel, it's carrying out the policy of the Rothschilds that control Israel. Now let's look at 9/11. The World Trade Center lease was purchased just a few weeks before 9/11 by Larry Silverstein, Rothschild Zionist, and Frank Lowy, Rothschild Zionist, and the deal was done with this guy called Eisenberg, Louis Eisenberg, Rothschild Zionist, the head of the New York Port Authority. The head of the CIA, who investigated what happened on 9/11, George Tenet, Rothschild Zionist. The Patriot Act, which was brought out, the Orwellian Take Your Freedoms Away Patriot Act in America, was co-authored, justified by 9/11, though it was written before because they knew it was coming, by Michael Chertoff, whose mother was a Mossad agent and who became the second head later of Homeland Security, an organization Orwellian that was justified by 9/11. At the time of 9/11, in the run-up to it, and then the war on terror and all that stuff, the Pentagon was dominated by Paul Wolfowitz, Rothschild Zionist, Dov Zakheim, the comptroller, who managed to lose trillions of dollars and still got away with it. And by the way, when one announcement was made of how much he'd lost or had gone missing in the Pentagon, they announced it on September the 10th, 2001.
According to some estimates, we cannot track $2.3 trillion in transactions.
I wonder if they realized that because of that, it would never see the light of day. Dov Zakheim, Rothschild Zionist, and people like Douglas Feith, Rothschild Zionist in the Pentagon. Now, as I've said earlier, the Bush administration was dominated and controlled by what became known as the neocons, the neoconservatives, which were a Rothschild Zionist organization, led by people like Richard Pearl, Rothschild Zionist, William Crystal, Rothschild Zionist, John Bolton, Rothschild Zionist, in belief in nothing, if nothing else. And then the 9/11 Commission report, which was the official report investigating 9/11. They wanted Kissinger to head it first until the public didn't take that seriously and he had to step down. But that report, which agreed that the official story of 9/11 was true, was written and overseen by Philip Zelikow, Rothschild Zionist. The judge, Alvin Hellerstein, who is hearing and overseeing the cases of the 9/11 families, who are taking out lawsuits to try to find the truth of 9/11, etc., Rothschild Zionists, making sure that truth never comes out. The man who coined the phrase, he was a Bush speechwriter, the axis of evil, which targeted Iraq before they invaded Iran and North Korea, was David Froome, Rothschild Zionist. So when you look at this, because Israel is the fiefdom of the Rothschilds, you see that this dynamics, or you'd think, is the man of 300 million people, the superpower, is the most powerful of the two. No, he is controlled from there because the Rothschilds control them. Do you know Israel has the second biggest F-16 fleet in the world, the biggest outside of America? It's a slither of land. How did they get them? Dov Zakheim, as comptroller of the Pentagon, Rothschild Zionist, made a load of weaponry and planes in America scrap when they weren't, so they could be passed for a song to Israel. This man, magnificent Israeli, called Mordecai Vanunu, went to jail for 18 years for revealing the truth that Israel is a nuclear power. He's still got massive restrictions on his movement and what he can say. And you know, and he announced officially that he was continuing it. There is an official policy that on Israel's nuclear weaponry, America doesn't ask and Israel doesn't say. That's an official policy. Iran hasn't even got it yet, and they want to invade the bloody place. The main lobby group in America is called APEC, America-Israel Public Affairs Committee, which sounds like an official, but it's a lobby group. It's headed by a guy called Lee Rosenberg, who is a very close friend of him and comes from the same political cesspit that we call Chicago. So when this question is asked, Americans, do you dare to say Israeli terrorism? No, because of the way it's controlled, like I say. The Rothschild Zionists control the media and Hollywood. Don't take my word for it. Los Angeles Times columnist Joel Steen, Rothschild Zionist, wrote an article proclaiming that Americans who don't think Jews, I would say Rothschild Zionists, control Hollywood, are just plain dumb. I had to scour the trades to come up with 6 Gentiles in high positions at entertainment companies, but lo and behold, even one of that 6, AMC President Charles Collier, turns out to be a Jew. As a proud Jew, I want America to know of our accomplishment. Yes, we control Hollywood. Leading Israeli paper columnist said, the Jews, Rothschild Zionists, I would say again, the Jews do control the American media. This is very clear, and claiming otherwise is an insult to common knowledge. And what do the media do? They keep the truth from us and keep us diverted from what's really going on. It's an elephant in the bloody living room, and people are terrified of going there because they're terrified of being called racist and anti-Semitic and all that. They'll call you anti-Semitic. I don't give a shit. I don't give a shit. Very quickly, it's the same in this country. There was a very, very good documentary, and it was a kind of stand back in amazement that it actually got out, by a guy called Peter Oborn, a journalist, in the Dispatches series on Channel 4 that looked at the Rothschild Zionist control of British politics through organizations known as the Friends of Israel. Each party has one, but of course they all connect, so it's actually one network. And again, just like in America, never any criticism. The British government under Tony Blair, and much of it under Gordon Brown to the end, was controlled by Peter Mandelson, Rothschild Zionist. The new Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, Rothschild Zionist. This guy, Tony Blair, was completely controlled by them, as Bush was, which is why they moved as one unit to do what the Rothschilds wanted, which was to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. And to shut people up, the Rothschilds have created organizations like the Anti-Defamation League. They set these organizations up to target those people who are saying the sort of things that I'm saying. The idea is to throw you're a racist at people, so to shut them up or to discredit them. Like I say, I don't give a shit. You throw it, son, and I'll hit the bugger back. Thank you very much. As a result, when you criticize Israel, you are promoted as criticizing Jewish people and therefore being racist. This is how it works. And I have to say, the robot radicals on the so-called left of politics are played like a violin by these people. And then you get people like the magnificent Norman Finkelstein, who's a Jewish man who's had his academic career destroyed for speaking out. His parents suffered in the concentration camps of Nazi Germany, and when he exposes these frauds and fakes in the Rothschild Zionist movement and what they do against Jewish people in general, he's called a self-hater. They can't say he's anti-Semitic, although sometimes they even use that. He's a self-hater. No, he's a decent man doing decent things. You want to try it? And the idea is to create, and they're doing it, hate laws in which truth is no defense. Even though what you say is true, it's no defense. If people are upset by it, then too bad, you've broken the hate laws. They're now targeting the internet, which has been so magnificent in communicating this information. And who's doing that? In America, J. Rockefeller, Rothschild Zionist. In this country, up to the last election, he rushed through a bill to this effect just before the election, Peter Mandelson, Rothschild Zionist. And just this week, Obama has nominated this lady, Eleanor Kagan, the Solicitor General, to go onto the Supreme Court. Two things. One, that will make Rothschild Zionists making up nearly half the Supreme Court judges of America, 4 of the 9, when they are well under 2% of the American population. And she is vehemently in favor of laws banning freedom of speech in association with her mate, tax the conspiracy theorist Sunstein. It is an elephant in the living room, and we need to address it if we are going to unravel this cabal, because they don't want to frighten us into not going here for any other reason than they know if we go here, so much is going to unravel.
The enemy we face is not a Democratic president or a Republican president. It's a global conspiracy. Yes, a conspiracy. Whenever more than 2 people get together to plan evil, illegal deeds, it is a conspiracy, and that's what we're facing. At the top of this conspiracy are a handful of ultra-wealthy multi-billionaires in the world. Some of them have been conspiring for more than a century. Their tools are the Council on Foreign Relations, the Bilderbergers, the Trilateral Commission. And they have tools in other countries as well. And then, of course, there are thousands of think tanks and entities which serve their purposes. Their ultimate goal is to get all power unto themselves and to enrich themselves beyond all reason. Well, most of them are already wealthy beyond all reason, but the more wealth you get, it seems, the more you want, and they're never satisfied. They want more wealth and more power. And this drive causes them to want absolute control over us, the people. That's not what America was founded to be. We were founded to be a government where the people are sovereign, and we must be that again.
And I wondered if you could address this military monstrosity that you have written about quite a bit.
Well, for one thing, the public doesn't like it. What's called isolationism, or one or another bad word, is pacifism. It's just the public recognition that there's something deeply wrong with their dedication to military force all over the world. Now, of course, at the same time, the public is frightened into believing that we have to defend ourselves. And it's not entirely false. A part of the military system is generating forces which will be harmful to us. Say, Obama's terrorist campaign, the drone campaign, the biggest terrorist campaign in history. It's generating potential terrorists faster than it's killing suspects. You can see it. It's very striking what's happening right now in Iraq. Yeah. And the truth of the matter is very evident. You see, go back to the Nuremberg judgments. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but in Nuremberg, aggression was defined as the supreme international crime, differing from other war crimes in that it encompasses all of the evil that follows. Well, U.S.-British invasion of Iraq is a textbook case of aggression. By the standards of Nuremberg, they'd all be hanged. And one of the things it did, one of the crimes, was to ignite a Sunni-Shiite conflict, which hadn't been going on. I mean, there's various kinds of tensions, but Iraqis didn't believe there could ever be a conflict. They were intermarried, they lived in the same places, and so on. But the invasion set it off, took off on its own. By now it's inflaming the whole region. Now we're at the point where Sunni jihadi forces are actually marching on Baghdad.
And the Iraqi army is collapsing.
The Iraqi army is just giving away their arm.
Right.
There obviously is a lot of collaboration going on. And all of this is a U.S. crime. A U.S. crime, if we believe in the validity of the judgments against the Nazis. And it's kind of interesting. Robert Jackson, the chief prosecutor, U.S. Justice, at the tribunal, addressed the tribunal, and he pointed out, as he put it, that we are giving these defendants a poisoned chalice. And if we ever sip from it, we have to be treated the same way, or else the whole thing is a farce, and we should recognize this is just victor's justice.
He said, never forget that this country is based on only one thing, due process of law. And that just has stayed with me ever since. And the other day, when they got rid of habeas corpus, which took some doing, but it was done after 700 years, we lost it. And I kept thinking of my grandfather, and I could hear his voice in my head. Due process of law. Without that, we are nothing.
Unless there's a sharp reversal in policy, unless we here in the so-called advanced societies can gain the consciousness of the indigenous people of the world, we're in deep trouble. Our grandchildren are going to suffer from it.
And I think you would agree that's not going to come from the power elite.
Certainly.
So it's up to us.
Absolutely. And it's urgent.
We need people with a moral compass in public office today. We need people willing to resist injustice and war in public office. Members of the Bush administration committed crimes against the American people, as well as international crimes, some of which have no statute of limitations. That continues under President Obama. The only way we can arrest this lawlessness is to hold them to account, not just in people's tribunals, which have their place, but also in courtrooms around the world.
And I think that if people did understand what had really happened at 9/11, you could very rapidly see a very substantial reorientation of public opinion.
Well, it's time that those of us who know the truth speak it out frequently and loudly. We must convince the American people and people in our government and even the President of the United States that these lies and the evil deeds which flow from them are destroying this nation, and that they must rise up. All of us must rise up as one and say no. No to the lies, no to the myths, no to the evil actions, no to the Patriot Act, no to the wars of aggression, and no to taking away our liberties given us in the Constitution. We must tell the truth, because only the truth can preserve this nation and restore our freedom.
It is 100% certain that 9/11 was a Mossad operation, period. The Zionists are playing this as an all-or-nothing exercise. If they lose this one, they are done. Dr. Alan Sabrowski, U.S. Army War College, retired. A time will come when a politician who has willfully made war and promoted international dissension will be as sure of the dock and much surer of the noose than a private homicide. It is not reasonable that those who gamble with men's lives should not stake their own. H.G. Wells.
In Nuremberg, the people of the world found out and why. But Nuremberg is more than an answer to a question. As Justice Jackson said, this trial is part of the great effort to make the peace more secure. It constitutes juridical action of a kind to ensure that those who start a war will pay for it personally. Nuremberg stands as a warning to all those who plan and wage aggressive war.